I did more than one.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Subcommittee on Energy and Environment. Today's hearing is on adaptation programs and policies as we prepare to deal with the inevitable consequences of climate change. Nearly 20 years ago, Congress passed the Global Change Research Program Act of 1990, which requires the preparation of a national assessment of the consequences of climate variability and change. This assessment was designed to help us understand the impacts of climate change in the United States. A distinguished panel of experts completed that assessment in 2000. One of the lead authors, Dr. Tom Carl, is with us here today. On the front cover of the report were these prophetic words: humanity's influence on the global climate will grow in the coming century. Increasingly, there will be significant climate change related problems that will affect each one of us. We must begin now to consider our responses, as the actions taken today will affect the quality of life for us and for future generations. In the decades since that report was completed, global warming has not waited. It has accelerated. Climate change is occurring as we speak, and the greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere will continue to warm the planet for decades. In the United States and the world, we must work together to successfully combat climate change. Mitigation, the act of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, will not be enough. Our country and other nations must also implement adaptation policies to respond to changes in our climate, in our ecosystems, and in our infrastructure. The many changes predicted in the national assessment are already happening, and they are happening faster than expected. An updated 2008 assessment of the 2007 report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change documented many of these changes. According to the UN panel, North America has experienced locally severe economic damage, plus substantial ecosystem, social, and cultural disruption from recent weather-related extremes, including hurricanes, other severe storms, floods, droughts, heat waves, and wildfires. Whether it's the eroding coastal areas of Louisiana, Texas, or the Atlantic states, the floods in the Midwest, hurricanes in Florida, wildfires in California, or the loss of snowpack in the Pacific Northwest, I'm sure that every member of the subcommittee has their own story of how a changing climate has affected their area. North America is not the only continent facing adaptation challenges. Internationally, low-lying island states like the Maldives could literally go under as sea levels rise. As a result, the President of the Maldives is considering purchasing land to prevent his population from becoming, I quote, climate refugees living in tents for decades. In Africa, the UN panel projected that by 2020, 250 million people will be exposed to increased water stress due to climate change, and that yields from rain-fed agriculture could be reduced by up to 50%, severely compromising food production. This in turn could lead to significant national security issues for the United States. The UN panel also noted that if warming continues unabated, 30 to 40% of all the species on the planet will be at risk of extinction. If the climate change bill I introduced last year, I included provisions for a national climate service. A national climate service would create a central source of federal information on climate change, ranging from projections of additional sea level rise to mapping the nation's best sites for solar and wind power. This information will be vital in the years ahead and will reap tremendous long-term dividends. I look forward to hearing from NOAA to discuss their plans to implement this much-needed program. Adaptation alone cannot solve climate change. We can and must take actions to reduce emissions. Yet as we enter the warming world that we have now created for ourselves, we must recognize that we as humans have worldwide responsibilities for all of God's creatures, both human and animal, many of whom have little or no ability to adapt to climate change on their own. They will need our help, and we should be prepared to provide it as best we can. I hope that that will be our goal as we craft our ongoing adaptation policies. I look forward to our witnesses' testimony. I turn now to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you said, our hearing today is on climate change adaptation policies. And I view, as you know, cap and tax as a policy that requires adaptation. How will Americans adapt to losing their jobs? How do we adapt to increased energy costs? How do we adapt to a legislatively imposed economic recession? How does the nation adapt to losing its superpower status? Cap and tax isn't our only option. We can pursue policies that will both help the environment and the economy. And by design, a cap and tax can only hurt the economy while providing a questionable environmental benefit. It is indeed a scheme. Absent of global agreement that includes the heavy emitting developing countries, cap and tax will only send energy costs up while sending employment numbers down or someplace else. This year, the U.S. will reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. We will reduce them. And we'll do it without cap and tax. Emissions are way down in Michigan this year, but emission levels haven't even dropped to the 1990 levels. And folks are asking for 80% below those levels by the year 2050, perhaps. How do we get those reductions down so far? Unemployment in Michigan is already about 13%. 15% perhaps isn't too far away, with greater reductions in emissions. But in this debate over climate change, we've lost sight of our real goal. We've lost sight of what our policies should achieve. The focus has become a cap and tax as an end in itself. What about reducing global temperatures? As one who believes that climate change must be dealt with on a global scale, I've advocated a no-regrets policy that will achieve the same, if not better. Results as an arbitrary cap and tax scheme at a fraction of the cost. In fact, there are policy options available that would have a net economic and societal benefit while at the same time cutting emissions. We've lost too many jobs already. We shouldn't pursue options that will make matters worse. If we're going to pass climate change legislation, it should adhere to the following 5 principles. 1, provide a tangible environmental benefit to the American people. 2, advance technology and provide the opportunity for export. 3, protect American jobs. 4, strengthen U.S. energy security. And 5, require global participation. These principles deal with the issue of cost versus benefit, the cost of action as well as inaction. Cap and tax schemes simply don't meet that criteria. We don't need costly mandates if we invest in clean coal technology, remove the regulatory barriers to nuclear power, reward efficiency gains, and allow a technology to succeed in the marketplace. And we won't need the developing world to remain in the Stone Age if we want to export American technology. We don't need to lose millions of jobs if we help our energy-intensive industries and domestic auto manufacturers with their R&D investments. Climate change is a global problem, and it requires a global solution. And without joint international action, jobs and emissions will simply shift someplace else, overseas, to countries that require few, if any, environmental protections, harming the global environment as well as the United States economy. And I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell.
Thank you. And I commend you for holding this hearing. It is important. You are building a record which I hope will be very important as we go through the consideration of climate change legislation. Today's hearing is also on a matter that is important. The funds generated by an auction are already in great demand for all manner of things, some with great merit, some with rather less, and some with, quite frankly, none. As we have already seen in the President's budget, the funds generated from an auction are being counted on for budget purposes. I note that the fourth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change noted, quote, observational evidence from all continents and most oceans shows that many natural systems are being affected by climate changes, particularly temperature increases. In the same report, we are warned that in the lifetime of a child born today, 20 to 30% of the world's plant and animal species will be on the brink of extinction if we don't take action now. I would note that the wildlands that we have a chance to save here are of immense value, not just to the future of society, but also to the purpose which we have, which is protecting us against climate change. So we must consider the value of marshes, mountains, forests, and ecosystems which can serve both as carbon sumps and also as opportunities for conservation in the traditional sense. A great conservationist, one that we all admire, the 26th President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, taught us that conservation is also a great moral issue, that it is our duty as it ensures safety and continuity for this nation. So, Mr. Chairman, as we move forward, I remain committed to securing a dedicated fund for natural resource adaptation. I encourage the members of the subcommittee to look at subtitle B of the Dingell-Bottcher draft released last year, which has in it carefully crafted natural resource adaptation language that was written by my staff and the staff of the Natural Resources Committee. And it has the support of most, if not all, the conservation community. Similar actions are going to be taken by the Committee on Natural Resources. So I want to thank you for holding this hearing today, Mr. Chairman, and I hope that my colleagues will join me in saving some of the precious treasures that we can save using the resources and the finances generated by the auctions which will take place for the monies that we can produce for a very important cause. I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
We thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The right of free speech is a great right that we have in this country. Very few times we use it to espouse our theological or religious beliefs, but we do have members of the clergy here as members of the panel. So I want to start with Genesis 8, verse 21 and 22. Never again will I curse the ground because of man, even though every inclination of his heart is evil from childhood, and never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. I believe that's the infallible word of God, and that's the way it's going to be for his creation. The second verse comes from Matthew 24. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. The earth will end only when God declares it's time to be over. Man will not destroy this earth. This earth will not be destroyed by a flood. And I appreciate having panelists here who are men of faith, and we can get into the theological discourse of that position. But I do believe God's word is infallible, unchanging, perfect. Two other issues, Mr. Chairman. Today we have about 388 parts per million in the atmosphere. I think in the age of the dinosaurs, where we had most flora and fauna, we were probably at 4,000 parts per million. There is a theological debate that this is a carbon-starved planet, not too much carbon. And the cost of a cap and trade on the poor is now being discovered. These miners lost their jobs through the last, and Mr. Chairman, we talked about this job loss. I've got an IDNR report, Illinois Department of Natural Resources, that points to 4 mines that were closed specifically because of the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990. I'm going to share those with you later because we did have that discussion, and I do appreciate that. Appreciate the hearing. and I look forward to the questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for this hearing today. I'm eager to hear from today's witnesses about how our communities and our world can adapt to climate change. And adapt we must. California's Department of Water Resources projects that the Sierra Nevada snowpack will experience a 25 to 40% reduction by 2050. These are not empty numbers. They represent real impacts of climate change that translate into serious risk for my constituents. As California's climate warms, more of the Sierra Nevada's watersheds will contribute to peak storm runoff. High-frequency flood events are projected to increase as a result. We have no choice but to adapt to these changing realities. In Sacramento, we live by two beautiful rivers, the Sacramento and the American. As global warming intensifies, scientists predict greater storm intensity that could forever change these rivers' flow patterns. This means that my district will have to cope with more direct runoff and more flooding. California has not hid from these changes. Instead, we are leading the way in cutting greenhouse gas emissions. We are developing a comprehensive climate adaptation strategy. However, California and the entire United States will need additional resources to adapt to the realities of climate change. Water resource adaptation strategies will need to be coordinated between local, state, and federal leaders. And states with strained budgets and growing needs will require federal funding in order to adapt and protect our communities. That is why upcoming climate legislation must be bold and resourceful when it comes to adaptation policy. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing, and I look forward to today's testimony. I yield back the balance of my time.
We thank the gentlelady. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening today's hearing on this important topic. I believe it is imperative to look at the role of adaptation as we continue to discuss cap-and-trade legislation. Human beings are designed to be able to adapt to changing climate temperatures, and there are repeated examples in history of mankind being able to adapt when temperatures have fluctuated. However, adapting to drastic job losses and a failing economy due to burdensome cap-and-trade or massive bureaucratic regulations or a national energy tax scheme will be incredibly difficult for all Americans. A March 2009 National Public Radio survey said that Americans' top concern is the decline in the stock market and investment losses. The second highest concern is job losses. Every American realizes that we're in a time of economic trouble. So we must ask the question, is it prudent to pass a cap-and-trade bill which will increase the cost of energy and conceivably cause 3.75 million job losses? What's more, is it prudent to pass legislation that will make matters even worse by levying a new national energy tax that could cost families up to $3,100 per year? Mr. Chairman, we need to carefully consider the negative impact a cap-and-trade bill with a national energy tax will have on our economy. I do not believe it is in the best interest of American families to pass a bill that will make their way of life harder and more challenging. Instead, we should focus on investment in economic growth and direct actions to adapt to climate change as better alternatives. I look forward to hearing our witnesses today and yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate you calling this hearing on adaptation policies and programs. One of the things I'd like to say is I'd hope whatever this committee creates, cap and trade, that those dollars that are generated from it will be designated for the direct utility consumer assistance and not be used as a piggy bank for the U.S. government. We need to make sure that we deal with the policies that we really are trying to protect. While Congress continues to debate how to address future greenhouse gas emissions, many scientists believe we must learn to adapt to changes in the Earth's climate caused from emissions existing in the atmosphere today. Human beings have been adapting in our world for literally millions of years. Altered climate systems may have impacts on our environmental and economic well-being, and agencies at all levels of the government must be tasked with implementing adaptation policies to respond to real or potential climate change threats. This is not an easy task. Previous natural disasters in the U.S. have shown how woefully ill-prepared our nation is in responding to natural events. A hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico is not unusual. Whether it was Hurricane Katrina or Rita, or the most recent one was Hurricane Ike, that was the first hurricane to hit the Houston area that I represent for 25 years. Thousands of homes were destroyed, vast areas of our community were left for weeks without power, and many areas were short on essentials, food, ice, or water supplies. We must avoid the mistakes of the past and create more efficient and responsive federal recovery efforts for natural events. Coordinating climate research and monitoring across the federal government will be challenging, and I hope to learn more about NOAA's efforts to provide policymakers with the latest climate information and assessments. Perhaps most important will be preparing officials for decision-making and future planning based on unknown or unreliable factors. According to the National Research Council, the decision rules that assume a stationary climate are no longer valid. I hope we can create the tools and provide the resources necessary to assist officials in preparing for outside-the-box thinking to address these future conditions. State and local governments would also be provided assistance to perform local assessments and climate impact-related preparation efforts, such as updating floodplain maps and reinforcing levees and flood drainage systems. In addition, we should provide for those vulnerable to climate change, particularly low-income Americans with insufficient resources to prepare or adapt to the changing environmental conditions. And thank you again for the hearing, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Great. We thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. I think we've got a very varied and potentially very lively panel, and I'm sure it'll be very enlightening as well as very entertaining. Now, I'm not sure how the climate is going to change in the future or necessarily what effect our behaviors today are going to have on the planet, but one thing I do know is we need to do a better job ensuring that people are prepared for changes in the weather, changes in natural disasters. This is something we can address without necessarily taxing carbon or imposing a cap on carbon or establishing a trading platform where sophisticated investors can work up exotic carbon options and manipulate the market and make great sums of money. Now, next month in my district, I'll be hosting an emergency preparedness summit. I want to ensure that I'm providing the people in my district with information and resources that they need to survive and overcome changes in the environment. I don't have to tell my constituents because the weather in Texas is legendary. It changes constantly, and we have some of the most varied weather between hurricanes, tornadoes, hailstorms, snow, sleet, dust storms. We have some of the most varied climatological conditions on the planet. But taking the time to prepare and plan ahead does save money and it does save lives. And that leads me to the point of today's hearing. Preparing for any potential effects of climate change would be far less costly to the economy than mandating a carbon cap. And I've said it before in this committee that strong and growing economies are more likely to develop the technology and the breakthroughs that we need to spur the next wave in energy innovation. Stifling the economy with carbon mandates may actually stifle our ability to solve this very problem. And yesterday in the Washington Post, the second editorial, I believe, dealt with just that issue, that it would be more straightforward and more honest of this committee to be talking about a carbon tax as opposed to cap and trade. I don't support a carbon tax. I think it's the wrong idea. But let's not hide behind this cloud of obfuscation with the cap and trade when really what we're going to do is tax energy, tax jobs, and tax carbon. I'll yield back.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Harmon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Global warming needs a two-pronged approach. One, mitigation, and two, as we've been discussing this morning, adaptation. We are just beginning to understand that even if we implement an aggressive mitigation policy and significantly begin to reduce greenhouse gases, our nation and the world will still confront the impacts of global warming, including changes in weather patterns, deadly heat waves, and increasing infectious disease outbreaks. This is why any climate bill passed from this committee must address adaptation. California is already in the process of developing a statewide adaptation strategy because of its vulnerability to global warming. For example, my district includes a breathtaking part of the California coast, one of our nation's most beautiful natural resources. As a result of rising sea levels and increased storm intensity, we could lose the beaches. This not only affects the quality of life for me and my constituents, but will have a huge financial impact with the loss of tourism dollars. My district will also confront other California-wide impacts, such as a reduced water supply as salt water mixes with our freshwater sources, increased air pollution, and more days with temperatures over 100. The consequences of global warming will also lead to major national and global security concerns. And as someone who focuses on security, this is where I think we all need to focus. They include large-scale human migration due to resource scarcity, increased competition for food, water, and other resources, increased frequency and severity of disease outbreaks. The impact of climate change, such as desertification in the Horn of Africa, could lead to conflicts and push countries to the brink of collapse. This could strengthen terror groups that are already active in the region and could be a central breeding ground and safe haven for jihadists. That is why I'm pleased that we are studying climate change as a part of our national intelligence estimates, and I think it is absolutely critical, Mr. Chairman, to focus on adaptation here as one of the strategies that will hopefully keep our country and the world safer. I yield back.
Great. We thank the gentlelady. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an important hearing, and I appreciate the panel's participation today. It's the job of Congress to seek ways to promote our country's economic prosperity and to support policies that protect our country's national security interests. It is my opinion that a cap-and-trade energy tax does neither and runs contrary to where our focus should be in these tough economic times. The members of this subcommittee do not all agree on the causes of climate change, nor have all of the experts that have come before our group. While the debate on the causes of climate change have not been settled, what also has not been called into question is the fact that a cap-and-trade energy tax will cost this country millions of good jobs and will force the average American family to pay thousands of dollars in increased energy costs. President Obama's budget director, Peter Orszag, has even testified that energy taxes designed to decrease carbon emissions will be passed on to American families. According to Mr. Orszag, the average American household, the cost to them would be about $1,300 a year for a 15% cut in CO2 emissions. He admitted to Congress last year that the price increases borne by consumers are essential to the success of a cap-and-trade energy tax. If the idea is to promote clean energy, why do we continue to reject nuclear power as an alternative source of energy? Energy production and development in our country has come a long way over the past few decades. Instead of taxing American families and the small businesses that create wealth in this country, we should promote policies that encourage development of new, cleaner technologies. That's the direction and the course that we're currently on, and we should continue to travel that path instead of crippling our economy when we can least afford it. There are countless small businesses across America that are watching the subcommittee's action very closely to determine their future in our country. They employ millions of Americans and want to continue to invest here. But if we act irresponsibly, these firms will pack up and ship their investment and American jobs overseas. And to add insult to injury, many of the countries where these companies will relocate do not have the environmental standards that we already have today in America. These are important issues we need to discuss, and I look forward to hearing from the panel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. We thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Melanson.
I'd like to thank you for holding this hearing today, and I appreciate the conversations we've had and your decisions to try and look at all energy sources. I appreciate the ability of you to recognize that we need to explore all avenues. We are here today and to talk about the effect of climate change on the world around us, and I find it interesting that some people say it's a world problem now. Since we didn't participate in Kyoto, we should have been there at that point in time, so we wouldn't be discussing what we need to be doing, which is different now. Even if this Congress enacted climate change legislation tomorrow, it'd be impossible to avoid the consequences related to the early effects of climate change. In fact, my district has felt the effects of warm ocean waters firsthand. 3 years ago, Hurricanes Katrina and Rita made landfall on the coast of Louisiana and leveled entire cities. Nearly 2,000 people lost their lives to those storms, and tens of thousands more lost everything else. The widespread devastation from the greatest natural disaster this country has ever seen is still evident today. Communities across the Gulf are facing rising tides, increased temperatures in the Gulf, which leads to stronger hurricanes, and in the case of Louisiana, the fastest sinking coastline in the country. Louisiana has lost over 1,900 square miles of land since the 1930s. That's more land than the entire state of Rhode Island. This country can't survive without coastal communities. These are the people that provide the seafood that we eat, the energy that drives our economy, and the labor that keeps our exports flowing to buyers around the world. Keeping our coastal communities alive ensures the health of the rest of the country, and to help these coastal communities preserve as the vibrant hubs of hard work and the culture that they are, we must all work together to find creative ways to adapt to the world that is always changing around us. Again, thank you for your interest and your help in this matter.
We thank the gentleman. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to again commend you and Chairman Waxman for holding these series of hearings. They're very informational and informative, and most of the time they're even entertaining. So I'm grateful, as always, for this regular order. I especially want to thank Lord Monckton for testifying. He is generally acknowledged as one of the most knowledgeable, if not the most knowledgeable, experts from a skeptical point of view on this issue of climate change, and we're very glad that he could stay over this week in the United States and testify at this important hearing. Today's hearing is about adaptation. Adapting is a common natural way for people to adapt to their environment. I believe that the Earth's climate is changing, but I think it's changing for natural variation reasons. And I think mankind has been adapting to climate as long as man has walked the earth. When it rains, we find shelter. When it's hot, we get shade. When it's cold, we find a warm place to stay. Adaptation is a practical, affordable, utterly natural reflex response to nature when the planet is heating or cooling, as it always is, doing one or the other. As Lord Monckton will testify, in the Middle Ages, it was warmer almost everywhere in the world than it is today. Some of our ancestors grew grapes in Britain, others sailed ice-free seas to settle northern places like Newfoundland and Greenland. This period used to be known as the medieval warm period, was followed by the Little Ice Age, a period of dramatic cooling which lasted until the middle of the 19th century. During the Little Ice Age, both the Vikings and the British adapted to the cold by changing. I suppose that one possible adaptation response of Viking retrenchment and British expansion is that we're conducting the hearing today in English instead of Norwegian. In the Chesapeake Bay and the Piedmont Marsh of the lower Hudson Valley, layers of sediment reflect what happened to the North American continent. That history shows that the nature of the climate is to change and to make organic shifts in temperature regardless of mankind's presence or supposed influence. Nature doesn't seem to adjust to people as much as people seem to adjust to nature. I think that it's inevitable that humanity will adapt to global warming. I also believe the longer we postpone finding ways to do it successfully, the more expensive and unpalatable the adjustment will become. Adaptation to shifts in temperature is not that difficult. What will be difficult is the adaptation to rampant unemployment, enormous, spontaneous, and avoidable changes to our economy if we adopt such a reckless policy as cap and tax or cap and trade. That will devastate our economy, and we will have great difficulty adapting to that. The majority of this committee has promised, and I hope this is a promise they don't meet, to introduce an economy-wide cap and trade bill in the next month. No matter that the past 7 years have witnessed a cooling period, Europe just experienced its coldest winter in the last 20 years, last winter. In the name of a house of cards posing as scientific certainty and an alarmist policy asserted by its followers with a religious fervor, the Democratic majority apparently is hell-bent to propose to cap our economy and trade away our jobs. Some of us on this committee are going to try to stop that, or at least deflect it. On top of the very real threat of job losses caused by closed factories, shut down mines, vacant power plants rendered uncompetitive under an American cap-and-trade scheme, the new majority's cap-and-trade goal is to make our electricity so expensive, our gas so pricey, and our food so dear that we will be forced to change the way we live. We will literally be forced to change the American way of life. We have had hearing after hearing where armies of witnesses representing both sides of the debate have warned us of the impact of cap-and-trade on everybody in this country but the mega-rich. The people at greatest risk are low-income, middle-income families, blue-collar workers, the elderly, and those whose jobs will be destroyed, and I say will be, not may be, will be destroyed if we adopt a cap-and-tax policy. The question is not how Americans will adapt to cap-and-trade legislation. The question is if and how we will survive when blackouts, rampant job loss, and empty cupboards threaten our very way of life. With those cheery words, Mr. Chairman, I yield back and look forward to this hearing.
We thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Barrow. The gentleman's time will be reserved. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I woke up this morning and watched a little bit of the morning news, and the headlines were about a very unnatural adaptation that's going on in North Dakota. Apparently, hundreds of citizens spent the night last night filling over 1 million bags with sand as they're trying to race against time to keep the Red River within its banks. It's now twice its natural level, and of course our thoughts go out to them. Last year I witnessed firsthand the extreme rain and flooding and devastation that people in my district and across the upper Midwest experienced as a result of intense rainfall. We lost homes and businesses and farmland, not to mention millions of dollars of productivity. Wisconsinites also will not soon forget the severe winter storms that we shoveled our way out of a year ago. My hometown had more snow than had ever been recorded since such measurements began to be taken decades and decades ago, and in fact we beat the old existing record by 40% approximately. Many, including leading experts on climate change, fear that as a result of unabated increases in greenhouse gas emissions, this record rain and snowfall will become the norm. These events used to be called 100-year events or 500-year events, and we find them happening separated only by years or decades these days. And as the various regions across the country and the world experience sweeping changes in precipitation and weather patterns, not only is the environment at risk, but also food and water supplies, ecosystems, social structure, and national security. Fortunately, adaptation efforts are occurring to minimize both the costs and severity of climate change. In Wisconsin, local communities like Dane County are assessing lake levels to minimize property damage, funding wetland restoration efforts, and updating the hazardous mitigation plan, which identifies potential impacts of natural hazards. Smart planning is essential to ensuring that the most vulnerable regions and populations are protected. I expect our witnesses today will inform us about other adaptation practices taking place around the globe. Finally, let me state what I hope many here will agree with, that the impacts of climate change vary greatly from area to area. As such, to the extent that future auction proceeds are directed to support adaptation strategies, we must recognize that states and localities are best equipped to make decisions about how to effectively and efficiently invest in these practices. I hope we keep that in mind as we craft our bill, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Great. Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and my good friend, Mr. Upton, for having this hearing. It's nice to have, as Mr. Barton mentioned, Lord Monckton here. He was a policy advisor to the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, and so he's a very good witness for us to have, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Beisner from Florida, from Broward County. Dr. Beisner is a welcome witness here from my home state. We've gone through this whole idea of cap and trade here, and there's a mantra for global warming, and now there's a mantra for cap and trade. But if you said to yourself, is there any country in the world who's doing cap and trade? Well, there is. The European Union has put in place cap and trade. Phase 1 was tried, and now they're into Phase 2. As I understand it, they had to suspend the cap and trade commodity exchange because of very serious problems on ethics. And I think, Mr. Chairman, in all deference to you, I think we should also have a hearing on how cap and trade is working in the European Union, because if you have something that's actually being implemented somewhere, then it does not become theoretical. It becomes pragmatic and actual. And so at this point, we can theorize here, but the bottom line is, let's see how it's working in Europe. Now, I can quote, obviously, statistics to show but the bottom line is that where are your statistics to show this enormous increase in jobs because of the greening or the cap and trade? So I think you have to show us that. We can show you statistics that we're going to lose jobs, we're going to increase taxes, but I think it's incumbent upon you folks, when you talk about all these new jobs from the greening of America, where are they coming from and what kinds of jobs are they? And I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for convening this important hearing, and particularly to the 7 witnesses. Thank you for coming forward today. Mr. Chairman, the effects of climate change at times now seem distant compared to the pressing matters of restoring our economy, dealing with AIG bonuses and the like, and of course, attending to our budget. But ignoring this issue would be a terrible, terrible mistake. Regardless of our success in curbing greenhouse gas emissions, the global temperatures will continue to rise in the coming decades. Consequently, we face rising sea levels, increased tropical storm activity, more precipitation in wetter areas and less in drier areas, and increased spread and range of disease. This will affect communities domestically and abroad, and low-income communities will be at greatest risk. It would be my hope, Mr. Chairman, that in a cap-and-trade bill, to see regular funding generated from auction revenue dedicated to 2 to 3% each for both domestic and international adaptation efforts annually. Domestically, the Department of Interior and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers should administer these funds to deal with sea level rise and flood reduction and wise water use. Internationally, the U.S. Agency for International Development, as we call it, USAID, should administer the funds to promote ecosystem-based adaptation. Further investments in deploying technology to developing countries, aiding farmers who face shifting weather patterns, and responding to increases in tropical-borne disease are imperative to confronting the coming problems rather than reacting to them. Again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for convening this hearing. I yield back the balance of my time.
Great. The gentleman's time has expired. All time for opening statements has been completed. We're now going to turn to our very distinguished witness panel. I will advise the panelists before we begin that I am going to strictly enforce the 5-minute rule. So my advice to you would be this. I am going to introduce you so everyone will know who you are. You will not have to reintroduce yourself. If you've got 3 key points and they're on page 3 of your testimony, move them up to the top. And then at the very end, at this time left over, you can tell us more about your wonderful organizations. Okay? But get to your key points. I will be tapping the gavel right at 5 minutes. So please try to make sure that you think in those terms as we're going along. Our first witness is Mr. Thomas Carl, Director of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's National Climate Data Center. Dr. Carl has had a distinguished scientific career and has served as lead author on many key scientific reports, including as a lead author on the recent 4th assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and as the co-chair of the National Assessment on Climate Variability and Change. We thank you for joining us, Mr. Carl. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you, Chairman Markey, Ranking Member Upton, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. First, I do want to make note that Dr. Lipchenko, our new administrator for NOAA, sends her regrets for not being able to be here today. This is her 3rd day on the job, and she looks forward to working with the committee in the future. I wanted to mention that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change definition of climate change refers to climate change over time, whether due to natural variability or the result of human activity. One of the things that we've already seen is many observed changes in the climate within the United States and globally. These include changes in air and water temperature, sea level, fresh water, severity of intense hurricanes. These kinds of changes are likely to increase and continue and have profound effects on the physical and biological environment, our economic prosperity, human health, and national security. There are typically two courses society can take to respond to climate-related impacts. First is mitigation. Mitigation meaning options for reducing heat-treating gases. Second is adaptation. Adaptation meaning changes that can be made to better respond to present or future climate change and other environmental conditions, thereby reducing harm and taking advantage of whatever opportunities a changing climate may present. Adaptation can include a wide variety of activities, farmers deciding to grow crops in a different way, moving business centers away from coasts, protecting coastlines. There's a countless number of adaptation plans that already have been devised. A few of them have actually been implemented, but very few. NOAA is the nation's provider of weather and climate data and information. We assemble this from a great variety of sources. NOAA's climate information services result from a long history of collaboration, coordination with our sister agencies, NASA, USGS, USDA, National Science Foundation, other government agencies. Climate information such as drought forecasts, long-term precipitation trends, fire forecasts, the frequency and intensity of coastal storms are all examples of the kinds of information that NOAA provides and will be useful for adaptation plans and strategies that will be developed by resource managers. NOAA works with customers and stakeholders to ensure we're providing high-quality information that is user-friendly, responsive, relevant to the issues being addressed. Increasing demands today for adaptation information, however, are now straining the ability of the agency to provide the kinds of information that's being requested at the appropriate space and timescales. Some of the categories for climate information, products and services, technical assistance training that NOAA provides today include scientific assessments of climate change and impacts, as the Chairman has mentioned. We work with a number of partners in providing information services in support of adaptation. This would include applications to living marine resources, applications to coastal communities, applications to water resources, just to name a few. In closing, I wanted to mention that despite the substantial efforts that NOAA has had to date, there still remain significant knowledge gaps and uncertainties for adaptation, as well as impediments to flows of knowledge and information relevant for decision makers. In addition, the scale at which reliable information is produced does not always match what is needed for adaptation decisions. We have considerable information about and confidence about changes in broad-scale aspects of climate change. Often questions are asked of us to provide local and regional information where the certainty is less apt to be as confidently applied as might otherwise be in a more general case. So there's clearly a need for some new tools and new science to ensure that adaptation progresses at the most appropriate pace. An effective response to changing climate conditions is going to require integrated, flexible, and responsive government-wide approach. To help this need, NOAA has been working to build on existing capacities to create seamless integrated processes for transferring climate science information to society and allow for informed decision-making and development of adaptation activities at federal, state, and local levels. I thank you for letting me have this opportunity today and be happy to answer questions subsequently.
We thank you, Mr. Carroll. Our next witness is Mr. John Stevenson. He is the Director for Natural Resources and Environment for the Government Accountability Office. Mr. Stevenson has appeared many times before this committee to provide GAO's perspective on energy and environmental issues. We welcome you back, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Upton, and members of the subcommittee. I'm here today to give GAO's perspective on how the United States is adapting to actual and anticipated changes in the climate. Thus far, attention and resources have focused largely on emissions reduction options, climate science research, and technology investment. However, adaptation is beginning to receive more attention because the greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere are expected to continue altering the climate system regardless of efforts to control emissions. While it may be costly to build coastal dikes to protect communities from sea level rise, or to build higher bridges, or to improve stormwater systems, there is a growing recognition in the United States and elsewhere that the cost of inaction could be greater. My testimony addresses the actions federal, state, local, and international authorities are currently taking to adapt to changing climate, the key challenges these officials are facing in their efforts to adapt, and the actions that Congress and federal agencies could take to help address these challenges. The information in my testimony is based largely on prior GAO work, but also draws on our ongoing study for this subcommittee. In summary, we found that a variety of adaptation-related activities are underway at different levels of government, including federal efforts like NOAA's to provide information and guidance to decision makers. In addition, federal resource management agencies like the Departments of Interior and Agriculture are beginning to consider climate change in their planning activities. We also found that certain state, local, and international governments are developing and implementing climate change adaptation plans. For example, we just completed a site visit exploring Maryland's strategy for reducing its vulnerability to climate change, focusing on sea level rise and coastal storms. We found that the state has completed an extensive mapping effort to identify coastal vulnerability and has begun educating coastal communities about changes that can be made to local ordinances to reduce coastal erosion and increase resilience. Specifically, Maryland provided guidance to 3 coastal counties recommending changes to planning documents, building codes, and local laws to address the risk resulting from sea level rise. We attended a public meeting held within the county threatened by sea level rise and observed how difficult it was to come to a resolution about the costs and trade-offs associated with taking versus not taking adaptive measures. Several of our recent reports illustrate a number of challenges faced by government officials in attempting to address climate change adaptation. First, climate change is one of many priorities competing for their attention. Second, a lack of guidance can constrain the ability of officials to consider climate change in management and planning decisions. Third, insufficient site-specific information can reduce the ability of officials to manage the effects of climate change on the resources they oversee. And finally, officials are struggling to make decisions based on projected future climate scenarios rather than past conditions. On this last point, a recent report by the National Resource Council stated that decision makers are not prepared to manage or plan for adaptation because many of their usual practices assume a continuation of past climate conditions. According to the NRC, this assumption is no longer valid because climate change will create a new and constantly changing decision environment. Our own 2000 report on FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program, which insures properties against flooding, and USDA's Federal Crop Insurance Corporation, which insures crops against drought or other weather disasters, reached similar conclusions. Both highlighted how historical information may no longer be a reliable guide for decision making. Unlike private sector insurers, neither federal insurance program had considered how climate change could affect their portfolios over the near or long term, potentially exposing the programs and taxpayers to greater financial risk. Our ongoing work for this committee will continue to explore these other adaptation issues and identify actions that can be taken to help move adaptation programs forward. To date, preliminary observations suggest a need for 1, improving coordination among federal agencies and with state and local governments, 2, preparing a national adaptation strategy and better guidance, and 3, developing regional and sector-specific information on the impacts of climate change. Some have also suggested the creation of a centralized government entity to collect and publicly share information about climate change impacts and adaptation strategies. We plan to continue to obtain information and perspectives from a broad range of federal, state, and local stakeholders, and later this year issue a report to the committee on the results of our work. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my statement, and I'll be happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
And we thank you, Mr. Stevenson, very much. Our next witness is Mr. Larry Schwager, who is the President and CEO of the National Wildlife Federation. Previously, Mr. Schwager served as President and CEO of the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy and as the first Vice President of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. He currently chairs the Green Group, a coalition of environmental organizations. We welcome you back, and whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee.
The microphone in just a little bit closer, please.
Yep. America has been blessed with an abundance of natural resources. Born and raised as a hunter and angler, I can say that our unique wildlife heritage has helped define the traditions and values of my family, and I know of many other American families for generations. Since the conservation leadership of President Theodore Roosevelt, millions of Americans have devoted themselves to protecting and restoring our country's natural resources. Now, because of unchecked global warming, a century of conservation achievement is in jeopardy. Today's hearing is essentially about whether Congress will ensure our children and their children are not left in a world that's fundamentally different from the one that we have enjoyed. I ask you, Mr. Chairman and subcommittee members, are you ready to talk about a world that no longer has polar bears, vast sagebrush steppe and free-roaming antelope, ice fishing and deep snows in the winter, cold water rivers teeming with salmon and trout? It's not an exaggeration to call what we're facing a climate crisis. In fact, the problem with the debate is so far is that the climate change has consistently been underestimated. The conservative projections that have framed this story for many years are now being surpassed at a rate that has even shocked scientists closely monitoring the changes. Congress must enact a two-part agenda in its climate and energy legislation to adequately address the climate crisis. First, Congress must cap global warming pollution now and begin steadily and rapidly reducing at a rate and pace dictated by the science and by the precautionary principles. Reducing carbon pollution in the atmosphere is the only way to head off the worst impacts of the climate change on people and on wildlife. Secondly, Congress must use the revenues from the carbon cap program to carry out a program that is clean, green, and fair. Clean because we must invest in clean energy technologies to move to a new place in this country. Green because we must provide a large-scale dedicated funding to protect our nation's wildlife and other natural resources from climate change. And fair because we must protect consumers and particularly help those who are most vulnerable around the world. I want to emphasize, if we cap carbon pollution but fail to invest adequately in natural resource protection, we will have accomplished only half of the job. Because we have already committed so much global warming pollution to the atmosphere, we will necessarily be grappling with the harmful impacts to wildlife for decades to come. National Wildlife Federation is working with scientists, resource managers, and a coalition of more than 700 hunting, fishing, and conservation organizations from every state in the nation to urge Congress to design climate legislation that conserves wildlife and other natural resources from the impacts of global warming. You'll see from the attached to my written testimony a set of principles from the National Wildlife Federation and 19 other national conservation and sporting organizations calling for large-scale dedicated funding for natural resource adaptation and for identifying key legislative provisions to ensure that expenditures of such funding is science-based and strategic. Also attached is a letter from 612 leading scientists highlighting the urgency of the issue and also calling for large-scale dedicated funding to the purpose of adaptation. We are gratified to see President Obama pledge in his campaign to use dedicated funding from the climate legislation for natural resource adaptation. We're also pleased that our coalition's principles were largely reflected in the Climate Security Act passed by the Senate Environmental Public Works Committee last year. Conservation practitioners have already started planning their natural resource adaptation efforts across the country, but planning will be wasted without the resources to put that program on the ground. Some have argued that funds for safeguarding natural resources should come from sources other than a CAP program. However, the principle of polluter pays must apply here. Any legislation that allows companies to pay to pollute must dedicate a portion of those payments to repair the current and future damages caused by that pollution. Mr. Chairman, the fourth report of the IPCC warns that in the lifetime of a child born today, 20 to 30% of the world's plant and animal species will be on the brink of extinction if we don't take action now. It makes it clear that unless we both cut carbon emissions and invest in adaptation, we could easily lose over 1 million species. To meet our fundamental ethical duty to pass on a healthy planet to future generations, we must reduce carbon pollution, and we must invest now in natural resource adaptation. We must protect the natural world that protects us and our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Swiger, very much. Our next witness is Dr. Calvin Beisner, who is the founder and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. Dr. Beisner also serves on the pastoral staff of Holy Trinity Presbyterian Church in Broward County, Florida. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Beisner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Upton, and members of the committee.
Put that microphone in just a little bit closer.
I have prepared a more extensive documented written testimony and submit it for the record. When the Apostle Paul wrote to the Galatians about meeting with the other apostles early in his ministry, he said, "They only asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I also was eager to do." That has been my motivation for over 25 years of study and writing on developmental and environmental economics. Both the Old and the New Testaments insist that rulers protect the poor from harm, following the example of Yahweh, who, Psalm 140, verse 12 tells us, will maintain the cause of the afflicted and justice for the poor. Yet often the very people who are responsible to protect the poor make laws that, whether intentionally or not, harm them. Climate change legislation may, I fear, be one such case. The naturalist atheistic worldview sees Earth and all its ecosystems as the result of chance processes and therefore inherently unstable and fragile, vulnerable to enormous harm from tiny causes. The biblical worldview sees Earth and its ecosystems as the effect of a wise God's creation and providential preservation, and therefore robust, resilient, and self-regulating, thus preventing small perturbations from setting off a catastrophic cascade of reactions. Both this biblical worldview and high-quality scientific empirical findings convince me that the fear of catastrophic man-made global warming is mistaken, and if so, fighting it is a waste. But even if not, fighting it may still be a mistake. The most thorough comparisons between the costs and benefits of temperature mitigation on the one hand and adaptation through economic growth on the other have concluded resoundingly that adaptation wins hands down. I'm aware that the Stern Review argues that the costs of doing nothing will exceed those of fighting warming, but it reaches that conclusion by assuming, among other mistakes, a zero-time discount rate to compare the values of present and future costs. If you doubt the buffoonery of that, see me afterward. I'd like to borrow $1 million for 90 years at zero interest. What concerns me most is the impact of climate policy on the poor. If we tax CO2 emissions, which, after all, enhance plant growth and so benefit all of life, if we tax them, whether directly or via cap and trade, we raise the price of energy and so the prices of all things made and transported by energy, which is essentially everything. This is particularly devastating to the poor, for whom energy constitutes a higher proportion of spending than for others. Forcing the poor in the developing world, as must be done if we seriously mean to stabilize CO2, to forego the use of carbon-based fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, the cheapest fuels per kilowatt hour of energy delivered, means delaying by decades or generations the time when they can afford electricity for their homes and industries, and thus delays for similar periods the time when they can refrigerate their food and so protect it from spoilage and themselves from undernutrition for lack of food and diseases from spoiled food. When they can heat their homes with clean electricity rather than by open fires of wood and dry dung, the smoke from which causes respiratory diseases that reduce the amount of work they can do and so reduce their incomes and kill 2 to 4 million per year. When they can air condition their homes and so close windows and doors, keeping out insects that spread malaria, dengue fever, and other diseases that kill millions every year and disable scores to hundreds of millions. As Lomborg puts it, in the third world, access to fossil fuels is crucial. About 1.6 billion people don't have access to electricity, which seriously impedes development. 2.5 billion people use biomass, such as wood, waste, and dung, to cook and keep warm. About 1.3 million people, mostly women and children, die each year due to heavy indoor air pollution. A switch from biomass to fossil fuels would dramatically improve 2.5 billion lives. Inexpensive fossil fuels contributed enormously to the economic development of the wealthy countries of the world. To demand that poor countries forgo their use is to deprive them of that benefit and is, I insist, a grave injustice. It is the demand of wealthy, powerful elites at the expense of the vulnerable poor. No alternative fuels can compete at present with fossil fuels for price. To compel their use in order to reduce CO2 emissions is therefore to raise the price of energy and to harm the poor. Until someone can justify such a regressive tax with its fatal consequences, I can only conclude that it is unethical and that we are morally obligated not to impede access by the poor to abundant, inexpensive fossil fuels. Thank you.
We thank you very much for being here. Our next witness is Lord Christopher Monckton. He is the Viscount of Brenchley. Lord Monckton is the Chief Policy Advisor to the Science and Public Policy Institute from 1982 to 1986. Lord Monckton served as a special advisor to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Please proceed, Lord Monckton.
Sir, I bring fraternal greetings from the Mother of Parliaments to the great Congress of your athletic democracy, and I pray that God's blessing may rest upon your councils. The right response to the non-problem of global warming, first slide please, is to have the courage to do nothing. Slide please. Thank you. There has been global cooling, as you see on that slide, for 7 years. The UN's climate panel has exaggerated carbon dioxide's effect on temperature sevenfold, verified by satellite observation, next slide please, that the diminution over time in outgoing long-wave radiation is 1/7 of that which the UN's computer models were told to predict. Next slide please. Carbon dioxide is accumulating in the air at less than half the rate that the United Nations had imagined. This century, we may warm the world by just half a Fahrenheit degree, if that. Next slide, please. If doing nothing is inexpedient, adaptation to warmer or cooler weather, when and if necessary, is many times more cost-effective than attempted mitigation. Adaptation to warmer weather is, of course, unnecessary unless the weather actually gets warmer. For 14 years, there has been no statistically significant global warming. Do not do or spend anything to mitigate or adapt to global warming until global temperature is 2 Fahrenheit degrees warmer than in 2000. That may not happen for at least a century. We have been adapting to natural variations in climate throughout the history of humankind. Adaptation is a practical, affordable, natural response to natural climate change. In the Middle Ages, it was warmer worldwide than today. Then global cooling set in. Our ancestors adapted. The Vikings abandoned their settlements in Greenland. Their graveyard at Valsay is under permafrost. It was frost-free when they were buried. In Europe, we adapted too. We moved to the valleys as the glaciers advanced, burying mountain roads, silver mines, and forests. Only now are all of these emerging once again. Adaptation, therefore, is at present unnecessary. Mitigation is always unnecessary. It is also disproportionately expensive, as Dr. Beisner has rightly pointed out. In particular, the impoverishing regressive poll tax that is cap and trade has an ignominious past and no future. It has collapsed twice in Europe and once in New Zealand. If the United States adopts cap and trade, she may find herself doing so alone. Cap and trade will create green jobs by the thousand while destroying real jobs by the million at a cost of trillions. It is senseless. Green jobs are the new euphemism for mass unemployment. Cap and trade will perversely increase the global emissions it is intended to diminish. You will transfer your jobs, industries and wealth to India and China. Their emissions per unit of production are far greater than your own. Protectionist tariffs, to try to prevent that, are the last resort of the economically illiterate and the politically desperate. Tariffs always damage those nations who impose them, and they also flout your nation's obligations to the World Trade Organization. They are ultra vires. For proof of the economic damage caused by unilateral but futile attempts at influencing climate, see the galloping exodus from California. Everyone with any get up and go is getting up and going, and unlike their robotic governor, they won't be back. Or see the food riots in a dozen of the world's poorest regions after the biofuel scam that arose directly from the global warming scare doubled food prices in 18 months. A third of your farmland no longer grows food for people who need it, it grows fuel for automobiles that don't. For us, dearer food is inconvenient. For starving millions worldwide, as Dr. Beisner has pointed out, it is death. Next slide, please. In Haiti, the biofuel-driven doubling of world food prices has forced the poorest to eat mud pies made with real mud. There is serious starvation going on around the world now. And this is directly not as a result of global warming, there hasn't been any for 14 years, but as a result of policies intended to mitigate what does not need to be mitigated. You must apply the precautionary principle also to the precautions. And finally, next slide please, King Canute reminded his courtiers of the limitations of earthly power when the waves disobeyed his command not to wet the royal feet. You can no more command the forces of nature than could King Canute. For the sake of your taxpayers and of the poor whom their taxes support and defend, please don't try.
Good show, Lord Moncton. Very good show. Our next witness is Mr. David Wascow. Mr. Wascow is the Climate Change Program Director at Oxfam America. Before joining Oxfam, he worked for Friends of the Earth, where he focused on a range of international environmental and development issues. We welcome you, sir.
Good morning. Thank you. Oxfam is an international development and humanitarian organization that works in more than 120 countries, including the United States. And I am here today because our staff and partners are already responding to the serious impacts of climate change, including heat waves, severe storms, sea level rise, and reduced water supplies. Both in the United States and abroad, we believe it has become essential to develop innovative and effective adaptation strategies for vulnerable communities. And as I will note in a moment, we also believe that these strategies are an opportunity for economic growth, both at home and abroad. We witnessed the reality of climate impacts firsthand in our operations in the Gulf Coast, responding to the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And although a particular weather-related event like Katrina cannot be specifically attributed to climate change, its impacts do stand as a tragic warning sign of the consequences if we fail to develop robust adaptation strategies. And let me just note for a moment here that I think our approach to climate change in general should be a proactive one, not reactive, and that is the case both in terms of reducing our emissions and also in doing adaptation, which is a matter of promoting resilience in a proactive manner. In the United States, low-income and other vulnerable populations will be disproportionately affected by climate change, as has been noted earlier. According to the recent findings of the federal U.S. Climate Change Science Program, many of the expected health effects are likely to fall heaviest on the poor, the elderly, the disabled, and the uninsured. Heat waves and extreme weather events are but two examples of climate impacts that will disproportionately affect the low-income and other vulnerable populations. As a first step to addressing these challenges in our country, the federal government should establish a national climate adaptation strategy, coordinate actions across agencies, and provide capacity-building assistance to state and local governments. All of these climate adaptation strategies should prioritize and include the participation of vulnerable communities, including improving the management of emergency response strategies for those who are most vulnerable. Internationally, the capacity of vulnerable communities in developing countries is even more limited and is being stretched even further than is the case here in the United States. Agricultural practices, water systems, disaster preparedness, and health systems will all need to be strengthened and improved in order to be more climate resilient. In these countries, the consequences of climate change reach significantly beyond direct impacts, of course. Stability and security will be undermined by climate change, and recently retired U.S. admirals and generals recommended that the U.S. take serious action to build climate resilience in those countries. Climate resilience, however, is not only a necessity, both in the United States and around the world. It is also smart economically. Taking preventive action now will pay for itself many times over, and studies have shown that reducing disaster risk saves $4 for every dollar spent on disaster preparedness. Adaptation strategies are also a key economic opportunity that we should seize. Innovative solutions can be an integral part of a global transition to a clean and climate-resilient economy. From developing climate-resilient buildings to buttressing sustainable transport systems to improving water systems and agricultural practices around the world, we can find substantial economic benefits from adaptation strategies. In the Gulf Coast, we have been involved with a promising example of climate-resilient economic development, building green, climate-resilient housing. And we are seeing the development of new markets at home and abroad for technologies and services to help communities build resilience. Water pumps and filtration devices, irrigation equipment, early warning systems for weather events, and weather-indexed microinsurance. U.S. companies and workers are well poised to partner with communities at home and abroad in deploying these technologies and services. For example, Pentair, a Minnesota-based company, manufactures pumps and filters for the entire water cycle and recently installed and maintained filtration systems in rural communities in India and Honduras. The development of new clean energy technologies to support climate adaptation and resilience, both here and in developing countries, is another economic opportunity. And I would just take a moment to note that in many cases, off-grid renewable energy technologies are in fact the most cost-effective, best way to provide energy sources to the poor in developing countries. Out of necessity, a wave of innovation is possible if we seize this opportunity to tackle climate adaptation and resilience that stands before us. So I encourage you to seize that opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. And our final witness is Bishop Callan Holloway, who was recently elected to his third term as Bishop of the Southern Ohio Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Prior to that, he served as assistant to the Bishop of the Southern Ohio Synod and pastor of the Western Lutheran Church in Dayton. Please begin whenever you feel comfortable, Bishop.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Chairman Markey and Congressman Upton, and members of the committee. I thank you for the opportunity to testify today. And I am with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and also representing that the National Council of Churches. Between them, the 5 million members of the ELCA and the 45 million in the National Council of Churches, I speak in their behalf. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak from the perspective of those of us involved in the faith community, as we're called, and to speak with you about global climate change, particularly our concern for those who are living in poverty around the world and here, who are already facing the impacts of this climatic change. For many people of faith, the call to be good stewards of the earth is grounded in God's command in Genesis to keep and to till the earth. Christians look to Christ's example and heed the call to seek justice, care for our neighbor, and provide for those who are living in poverty or otherwise oppressed. And our response to climate change must reflect the principles of stewardship and justice, particularly for those who are living in poverty around the world. They are the ones who are least responsible for the changes taking place and most likely to suffer from its impacts. The diverse coalition of faith communities, including Catholics, Protestants, evangelicals, and our interfaith partners, have endorsed the climate fairness agenda, which unites our communities behind the goal of working to ensure that the United States government aggressively reduces greenhouse gas emissions while providing for the most vulnerable here in our own country and around the world. And I'd like to submit to you for the record, a document, Climate Fairness Agenda, a religious call to address global climate change and poverty.
We will include that in the record without
Thank you very much, sir. In its 2007 assessment reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, paints a pretty bleak picture of God's creation and those already struggling with hunger and disease. The report details how climate change will increase food insecurity in places where food is already scarce, while reversing progress made to fight against hunger in other regions. Rising temperatures will increase water scarcity in some areas and spread of disease such as malaria, fever, West Nile virus. More severe natural disasters and longer-term drought will lead to increased migration. I've seen this with my own eyes and worked with those who are working with the people who are most affected by this. I've been privileged to see this in my own church in our response to global climate change, through my own synods companionships in Tanzania, Brazil, and also in Kazakhstan most recently. And I've met farmers who are struggling with extreme weather pattern changes and unpredictable rainfalls. And our people are working hard, fast, furiously, and in partnership with great numbers and diversity of other people and organizations to provide basic water supply, cleanliness, and opportunities to eat. For us, we're blessed in our country with waking up in the morning and deciding what color tie to wear or what color iPod to have hanging from our sides, while most people around the world are waking up deciding if they're going to eat that day. Although churches and other NGOs are already working to assist communities adapting to climate change, the reality is that the changes are far too great for us to manage alone. We cannot do that alone. We are not structured for it. It is not our primary calling. A number of proposed bills in the House during the 110th session, including Chairman Markey, your recommendation with the ICAP bill, and Congressman Doggett's Climate Matters bill, and the Boxer-Warner-Lieberman bill in the Senate, include an international adaptation assistance language and funding. There are several items I'd like to get to in this report. The funds should be appropriately targeted in terms of recipient countries, by 10%. Local communities must be engaged in a participatory process through transparent mechanisms, and funds should be provided to fund the current levels of official development assistance. The funds should be targeted for climate impact, and legislation should enhance developing country efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The U.S. must acknowledge its role, both claimed and granted, in the responsibility for this global crisis, and should commit to providing substantial financial support, reaching between $7 and $21.5 billion a year by 2030. Some will say we cannot afford to make this sort of investment at a time of global economic turmoil. I counted that if we do not do it, we cannot afford that either. I thank you very much as we look to protect creation and God's people.
Thank you, Bishop Holloway, and to the other 6 witnesses watching you go 1 minute over. I went to religious school every day from age 6 to 26, 20 years in a row, and I don't have it within me to tell anyone wearing a collar when to stop, okay? So I'm disciplined to think that way. So I apologize to the other witnesses, but I was gripped by the admonitions of those 20 years every day in religious school. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, would you yield for a question?
I'll be glad to yield.
May I inquire as to whether or not this hearing is being covered on one of the C-SPAN channels?
You mean one of the internal House channels?
No, one of the broadcast channels so people could, and we've got an incredible panel of witnesses. And
It is not being covered, but that is not our decision. That's a decision that's made by C-SPAN or by the internal House.
But none of your gripping hearings have been covered on any broadcast television. I think that's a mistake. Just to watch the body language of Lord Monckton while Mr. Waskow was testifying, and vice versa, I think would have been worth the price of admission for our C-SPAN audience.
I'm kidding.
And I regret that my constituents aren't able to tune in.
Now, I'm with you. We don't have to go to Piccadilly. Piccadilly comes to us, and I'm very, honored that we have all these people. But again, it's not within our control, okay? The cameras are there. They are working. If anyone wants to pick it up, it's their decision, not our decision at all. And for my purpose, we're better off having this full discussion. I would have wanted everyone to have just heard Bishop Holloway tell us what our moral obligations are. But it's not my decision.
Well, just for the record, Mr. Chairman, you're infinitely more interesting than a budgetary hearing. And I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman, I think. The chair will recognize himself for a round of questions. I'm going to go to you, Dr. Carl, and relate back to Lord Monckton. Could you tell me, based upon 150 years of data from the World Meteorological Association and extensive analysis of public data by governments around the world, including the United States government, is the Earth cooling in the long term, or is it warming as a result of human activity?
I can make this answer very, very short, Chairman. There's no question the Earth is warming. Out of the last 14 years, 13 of them have been the warmest in our recorded history in terms of
Can you say that again, please?
Of the last 14 years, 13 have been the warmest on record in our observed climate record.
Okay, so when Lord Monckton goes back to 1998, and he says, since then we've been on a cooling trend, is it a little bit like saying, well, you know, Babe Ruth, you know, when he started hitting his home runs, there had never been any more than 20, and when he hit 60 in 1927, there was a decline after that, looking, of course, at Hank Greenberg's 58, Hack Wilson's 56, Jimmy Fox's 58, and so there was kind of a downward trend because no one could quite match Babe Ruth. On the other hand, Babe Ruth had just completely eclipsed anything that had existed before then. Isn't that a little bit like what Lord Monckton is doing here in saying there's been a decline from 1998 without reflecting upon the fact that, as you pointed out, can you give me that number again?
Over the last 14 years, 13 have been the warmest on record going back to...
Warmest on record, thank you. So there's a little bit of disingenuousness in Lord Monckton's testimony, and I think that the incompleteness historically in his testimony is something that doesn't serve the committee really that well, because it's these longer-term trends that are at much higher levels by a significant amount in terms of their warming impact that is of great concern, and why the United Nations put together that group of 3,000 scientists to reflect upon that and to make recommendations to the world and to the United States. Mr. Schweiger, could you reflect upon what Mr. Kyle just pointed out?
One of the ways to think about this is to think about what's happening to the Earth. And if you look at what's going on in the Arctic region, the melt of the Arctic is setting all sorts of new records. The thing that concerns me most is this carbon storage that we find in the Arctic region is now being given off at I think, quite significant rates. The leakage of methane. The boreal forests in Canada, for example, are going to be giving off more carbon in the next 10 years than they're going to be storing. 9 of the next 10 years are going to be net producers of carbon. So as the Earth warms, it begins to behave in ways that are very troubling. And so I would suggest to us that we're in a second phase of global warming, that phase where humans are not only contributing, but we're now seeing nature giving back some of its carbon stores. And I would ask the committee to pay close attention to that.
Thank you, Mr. Schweiger, very much. Dr. Carl, in the legislation I introduced last year, it established the National Climate Service. Does the administrator of NOAA support a climate service? And could you distinguish between what a weather service and a climate service would provide in terms of information for ourselves and for the rest of the world?
Yes, in fact, Administrator Lubchenco has made it clear during her testimony for her confirmation hearing that she does support the development of a national climate service, similar scope as compared to a national weather service. The differences between a climate service and a weather service is that a climate service would be focusing on aspects of climate change mitigation and adaptation, as we're discussing here today, delivering products and services in that respect. I've often been asked the question about, well, would the Weather Service and Climate Service, would there be a demarcation between what time scale a Weather Service addresses and a Climate Service addresses? And I think the way to think about this is that obviously a Weather Service is going to continue to protect us, get us out of harm's way, protect life and property, forecasting the kind of weather events that occur on a near real-time basis. But as Congressman Baldwin pointed out, when we have floods like we had last year, we want to be able to better understand whether there are anthropogenic influences that may be causing such floods, and so a climate service would want to be there helping to explain those conditions, intense and severe hurricane seasons, are there contributions that humans may be adding to those kinds of events. So that is best I can do in terms of helping to describe the differences.
Thank you, Dr. Connell, very much. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Lord Monkton wanted to have a say in that first question that you posed. So, Lord Monkton?
Certainly, sir. Yes, I do. If you want it put in perspective, let's put it in perspective. Let's go back 600 million years to the Cambrian era. Oh, yes, I remember it well.
Now, just for the record, that is, I think, is when the Chicago Cubs last won. So it's okay. I don't know if you know baseball as well.
I'll ride with that. Certainly, 600 million years ago, there was about 20 times as much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as there is today. And global temperature was about 12.5 Fahrenheit degrees warmer than today. That's how much extra carbon dioxide you have to put in the atmosphere to get that kind of increase. And for most of the last 600 million years, it has been around 12.5 degrees warmer than today, Fahrenheit. However, if we come more recently to the last 10,000 years, since the end of the last ice age, for most of the last 10,000 years, it has been around 4 or 5 Fahrenheit degrees warmer than today. Most recently in the Minoan and Roman and medieval warm periods, it was warmer than today. There was then a period of considerable cooling. Indeed, the sun between 1645 and 1715 was at its lowest level of activity in 10,000 years, according to sunspot records. Now, thereafter, the sun's activity gradually increased until in the last 70 years of the 20th century, it reached what is known to solar physicists as a solar grand maximum. That coincided with a considerable period of warming. However, the warming period of 1975 to 1998, when it stopped, there was no greater warming rate then than there was between 1860 and 1880, and again between 1910 and 1940. There is therefore no anthropogenic signal whatsoever in the temperature record so far. The IPCC has predicted global warming, and yet for the last 7 years there has been global cooling. Now, that global cooling is, of course, a consequence of natural variability, just as very nearly all of the global warming of the 300 years that preceded it is, on any view, also attributable to natural climate variability. There is therefore nothing in the temperature record that should give us any cause of concern to date.
Thank you. Mr. Carl, I regret that I didn't bring this publication, but I read a story just this week. It was made public. The Chinese apparently had indicated that they did not have any more recent data than, I believe, 1994 in terms of specific emissions within their country. And I think South America, was it Brazil? Was it Brazil? Was close to the same. How do we actually monitor what other nations are doing? One of the concerns that a good number of us have is if we imposed a cap-and-trade scheme, that particularly countries like China and India would welcome that, because they would see that job growth be exported from the U.S. To those countries. And as we've seen with China building a new coal plant, literally 2 every single week, how is it that we're going to actually be able to monitor the emissions from those nations when, in fact, they're at least as we saw this week, putting up their hands and saying it's not any of your business. What type of tools do we have?
Yeah, right now, NOAA has something called the Carbon Tracker Program. You can actually go on the web and take a look at our best estimates as how carbon is being moved around the world, and this is actually into the atmosphere. We actually have observatories in North Pole, Barrow, and several other locations. We've got a global monitoring network. We collect flash samples from across the world to try and measure atmospheric concentrations. This kind of information is used in models, and there's some technical methods that are used to try and go back to the sources when we actually measure the amount of carbon in the atmosphere so we can better understand where they're actually being emitted and being absorbed. It's an area in which NOAA is very interested to continue to improve our capabilities here, and we've actually put forth a number of proposals.
Did you see the report that was put out this week by the Chinese?
No, I have not.
We'll get it, and I'd like you to maybe comment in writing. We'll get it to you and do that. I see my time has expired. I yield back.
Great. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from, I'm sorry, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan. Have an obstructed view seat here. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dinkle. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Dinkle, if you could. Great, thank you.
Last year, Mr. Boucher and I introduced, released a draft in which we addressed the question of using some of the resources generated by the cap and trade to see to it that we could use these allowances for safeguarding fish, wildlife, natural resources from the impacts of climate change. We also had the intention of seeing to it that we would preserve wetlands, marshes, mountains, forests, grasslands, and things of that kind. Have you seen that draft?
Yes, I have, sir, and I wanted to thank both of you for that sponsorship.
Do you support it?
We do support that.
National Wildlife does?
And a number of other organizations that are signed on to our statement also support that effort. We believe that it's important to take some of the revenues that are generated from a cap and invest program and apply them to protecting these vital resources. The number that was in the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee last year is a good number, I think, to start with for efforts going forward. But we clearly think that wildlife need funding, that adaptation needs to be implemented. There are plans that are beginning to be developed. Much more needs to be done across the entire country, and in fact.
Would you equate this with adaptation, the language that Mr. Boucher and I have released? Would you equate that with adaptation in a good form?
Absolutely.
Very good. Given the extensive conservation investments that we have made in the Congress, going back to Pittman, Robertson, Dingell, Johnson, and all the other programs of this kind, how much risk is there that these investments could be squandered if we fail to invest now in natural resource adaptation?
One example of the risk that we face, there was a recent assessment of the national wildlife refuges, and over 60% of those refuges that were studied will be out of their biome if we continue to on the course that we're on today. So what that means is the natural diversity that existed on those refuges will no longer be able to survive in the warming climate in those locations. So there's a great urgency to help in that transition.
Thank you. Now, going across, starting with you, Bishop Holloway, if you please. Do you support the idea of adaptation? Absolutely. Next witness, do you? Yes or no?
Yes.
Next witness, please.
Sir, if you must do anything, then adapt. That's what we've been doing since we were created. I'm sure we'll continue just fine, and we probably don't need Congress to help us.
Thank you. Sir?
Yes, adaptation is the natural human action in response to all changes around us. We have done that for thousands of years, and I think we will continue to do that very well with or without central planning.
Does that mean yes or no?
Yes.
Mr. Schweiger, I believe you've already been next witness.
Yes.
Final witness, sir?
Yes, and if I could just add, if I may, one of the real challenges for adaptation will be for us to be able to provide the kinds of climate-related information that will be necessary, because the climate will be constantly evolving and changing, and developing those information transfers between what we understand the science and the engineering practices that are so important to put in place for adaptation. That will be a key linkage that I think we will have to ensure that we do a better job in developing.
Thank you. Now, I have another question here for you, sir. I am curious, and I want you, with your expertise as a member of the GAO, how are we're going to generate enormous sums of money from the sale of these allowances. How are we going to keep those sales honest? We are obviously going to have lots of inspector generals. We are obviously going to have lots and lots of responsibilities imposed upon these people. We're obviously going to have questions with regard to how we handle the accounting. Can you give me a quick and dirty answer as to how we're going to address this problem of keeping honest men, or maybe somewhat dishonest men, honest, given the huge temptations we're going to lay before them?
Well, this is part of the details of the cap and trade program, and whether or not you use offsets or not as a cost containment mechanism. Both of those features require emissions, not certainty, but certainly good estimating techniques and verification techniques to ensure that the baseline emissions are correct. Then we're proponents of an auction rather than allocation of the allowances to make sure that the price of carbon is set correctly. We think carbon offsets is a form of cost containment, but it too has a lot of problems in verifying that the additional carbon offsets you would get would be additional. That means that would not have occurred anyway. So the devil's in the details for all of this legislation. There is much to do to determine what techniques should be used to estimate allowances, to verify allowances, and to manage a cap and trade program if that's the way we go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You were very generous.
Mr. Barton of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to thank all of our witnesses. I really appreciate you all being here. I'm going to focus on two of our witnesses, Mr. Carl and Lord Monckton, on some of the science. Mr. Carl, you are a climatologist, is that not correct?
That's correct.
And you are part of the scientific panel of the IPCC.
I was lead author and convening lead author on the first 3 IPCC reports and a review editor on the last.
So we could consider you an expert. You wouldn't disavow that descriptive.
You could consider me anything you'd like, sir.
Well, I think you're an expert. Now, Lord Monckton presented the committee 3 charts. One is a chart from the Hadley and NCDC monthly terrestrial global temperature data set and the RSS and UAH satellite lower troposphere data sets that shows a global cooling over the last 7 years of about, if I read it correctly, equivalent to 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit a century. Is he lying to us?
Well, that's a very unusual way of presenting data that has never in the IPCC been combined in that way. And let me give you an example why.
But I mean, is the data that he presents the factual?
I can't attest to the figure you showed on the figure so quickly. I looked at it for
Will
3
you do
seconds.
that? Will you research it and send a report to the committee whether he's lying to us or telling us the truth?
I certainly will. I can tell you that when IPCC does detection and attribution studies, one of the key issues that we look at is the change in the rate of temperature throughout the atmosphere, and that figure actually averaged temperatures at the surface with temperatures throughout the troposphere, which is not the way we go about doing fingerprint attribution. So that was quite unusual when I noticed that right off.
Okay, but it is theoretically possible he's telling the truth, or this chart is factually correct.
I'll reserve judgment when you send it to me, and we'll take a look at it.
And give us an honest assessment.
Best we can do.
Now, his other chart shows that the headline is the UN exaggerates the greenhouse effect by 7-fold. Are you familiar with that graph, and is that another case of creative graphing, or is that the truth?
If I remember, this is the figure that was showing the rates of carbon emissions. Is that
14 years of model predicted black and ERBE satellite observed red change in outgoing long-wave radiation from the Earth's surface?
Yeah, in fact, last week, Chairman Mullihan's committee had a hearing on climate data records. And that graph, one of the important aspects of when you show Earth radiation budget data, you have to take into account the fact that these measurements are made from satellites that change their orbit over time and from different satellites. And one has to stitch together the climate record from those satellites.
Well, can you look at this one also?
Yeah, it's incorrect. I can tell you off right away.
You just say this one's wrong.
I can, because I saw that immediately. That is incorrect because it hasn't
and
taken.
What about his last chart that shows CO2 concentrations are rising below the prediction that the IPCC keeps saying these huge increases are going to in CO2, and it just doesn't appear that factually that can be verified by actual data collection. What's the story about that?
Yeah, we actually, I was quite surprised to see that graph because right now there's a unified synthesis product the Climate Change Science Program has put together, and it's just gone through its second round of public review comments, and we hope to have it cleared through the agencies, the Climate Change Science Program agencies, in the next few months. But if you look at that document today, there's actually a graph in there showing the rates of emissions over the past 15 years. And if you look around, compared to IPCC scenarios...
I'm about to run out of time, and I want to give Dr. Monckton, or Lord Monckton, a chance to...
The bottom line is what our concern is the rates of global emissions are faster than what some of the IPCC emission scenarios suggest today.
Lord Monckton, he basically says you're a liar. What's your...
Well, of course, if you concentrate on emissions, then he's right. Emissions are rising faster than the IPCC predicted because they didn't expect China to do what China said she would do and continue to build power stations at a rate of 1 a week burning coal. However, concentration remaining in the atmosphere has indeed fallen, and the reason why is that it hasn't fallen, but it's gone up much slower than the emissions have and much below what is forecast. And the reason why that is that as the UN itself admits in its documents, it is incapable of adding up what's called the carbon budget in and out of the atmosphere to within a factor of 2 of the right answer.
Well, Lord, just as I've asked Mr. Carl to try to verify what he said for the committee's consideration, could you also attempt to give some supporting documentation to prove that your charts are accurate and factually based?
Certainly, I'll be happy to supply a paper which is currently out for peer review, which explains exactly how these 2 graphs are compiled. The third graph is from a scientific paper, one of a series that's appeared in the literature on this question of the outgoing long-wave radiation not diminishing as fast as the UN's models predicted it would, and I will give you the references to various papers on that subject.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The lady from California, Ms. Matsui.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to shift a while here to get to from the global level to so-called ground level in my community. Millions of people in my state depend upon levees to protect them, and climate change will increase the state's flood risk by causing a shift toward more intense winter storms, which could produce higher peak flows. Flood systems throughout the state must be upgraded and managed to accommodate the higher variability of flood flows to protect public safety, the economy, and ecosystems. And this is not cheap. In 2007, Sacramento property owners voted to assess themselves almost $300 million for their local match to help achieve 200-year flood protection in the Sacramento area. Shortly thereafter, the state legislature passed legislation authorizing the state to participate in the 200-year flood protection program and contribute 70% of the non-federal costs of the program. In 2008, our flood control agency established a development fee program to add to the local funding available for the 200-year program. Now, Mr. Schwager, as you can see, my community has taken upon themselves to be leaders in adaptation and water management. However, Sacramento's risk of flooding remains high, and we need additional help. In your testimony, you referenced a lot of communities and their efforts to adapt. What are other communities doing to help prevent flooding, and how are they raising the necessary funding?
A number of groups are working. I'll give you one example in coastal Louisiana to reestablish some of the damaged wetland systems in the New Orleans area, because we believe that by building back this natural resistance, we will reduce the storm surges and will also provide protection for nearby communities. So we think that there's an important investment in that area. I would also suggest that the Army Corps of Engineers needs to change the way they do their planning and look forward and not look backwards. You know, we've been designing structures to look at the last 100 years, and I think it's important that Congress give the Corps direction to look forward and understand the modeling and how it might impact communities. I think that there are many community risk involved in climate change, and there are also enormous wildlife risk. Some of your fishery resources, for example, in California are being lost as coastal areas are being lost due to sea level rise, and important wetland systems are disappearing.
And in your opinion, what percentage should the federal government contribute to adaptation versus states and communities? And, you know, we're looking for financing. What are the types of financing should we look to in tough economic times?
The Senate Environment and Public Works Committee last year had identified a $7 billion annual average funding for the first 2 decades for the climate adaptation funding for wildlife. And if you look at that, that's about 1% of the economic benefits from outdoor recreation, forest and wetland conservation. So we think that's a reasonable starting point for those kinds of investments. And I should say that there's also a number of other important community investments that need to be made, and some of those are in fact overlapping, because what benefits humans also benefit wildlife in certain cases.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Stevenson, I understand the GAO is still analyzing adaptation efforts as you complete your study this year. Based on what you have uncovered, have you seen examples of adaptation efforts relating to flood control?
Yeah, the one I mentioned in Maryland, we just visited the state of Maryland and are looking at their efforts to address sea level rise. And at this point, it's more one of providing information to counties subject to sea level rise and advising what they can do in their laws and their land management use plans to address those problems.
So
but they're going to have to make economic decisions in the future as to what kind of adaptive measures they may want to take.
What is the federal government doing to better understand the flood risk and hydrologic impacts of a changing planet?
Well, there are many research efforts, both by the federal government and others, both in the U.S. and throughout the world, on this issue. What we're suggesting is that there needs to be more regional and localized information so that individual communities and governments can make decisions on what they should or shouldn't do. But we don't think the information is specific enough to the local level to be able to make those decisions.
And what should Congress specifically do to finance flood control efforts as they relate to climate change?
Well, we haven't really looked at that issue. We did look at the national, federal flood insurance program, and we think it's interesting that there have been no portfolio adjustments on the federal government's part for their for the insurance industry, similar to what Swiss Re and some of the big reinsurers of the world have already done. They've already looked at climate change projections and adjusted their portfolios to minimize their risk, and we're suggesting that the federal government should do the same thing both for crop insurance and flood insurance.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Pitts, Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Lord...
I'm sorry. Excuse me. You sure? I'm sorry.
Lord Monkton, you say the European try at cap and trade has failed. Would you elaborate, and why do you suggest the U.S. may go it alone?
Certainly. You'll go it alone, I think, to answer that question first, because those who have tried cap and trade have found it doesn't work. Those who are thinking of trying it are, in the light of that, beginning to revise their opinions on whether they should. There are many problems with cap and trade, but to answer your question about the European experience in particular, the European Union, which is governed by effectively a bureaucratic centralist dictatorship in Brussels, decided to allocate to each member state a right to emit without payment, which exceeded each state's total emissions. Not surprisingly, therefore, the price of the right to emit carbon per tonne fell to the market clearing level of 0 on the artificial carbon trading hot air market. It's called the trading in hot air on the London market in recognition of its general uselessness. So it failed, and they therefore decided that they would issue an edict that each country was not allowed to give away as many free permits as before. However, the economic collapse then supervened, and when you have a declining economy, then what happens is whatever price you try to set for carbon will promptly fall on the open market, and we're now once again trading carbon permits at dangerously close to 0. So for the second time, the European system has failed in much the same way as the New Zealand system has also failed. And in Australia, where they had been contemplating carbon trading, the Senate, much as here, has decided that it doesn't like the idea. So if you do impose carbon trading, then you could be shooting yourselves uniquely in the foot, because most other countries of the world are at present disinclined to follow you.
And whom do you believe will be most affected by cap and trade or a carbon tax or any other method of increasing energy prices?
That's an extremely good question, and the answer is unfortunately horrifyingly clear. It is low-income families. It is the poor. Why? Because a larger proportion of their income is devoted to spending on energy than any other sector. Now, of course, there may or will indeed be elaborate attempts to make transfer payments to the poor to try to cushion them to some extent or even fully from the effects of this misguided type of taxation. But unfortunately, that then leaves the cost of it falling disproportionately on the middle class because, as you may know, President Obama has recently given strong indications to the other people who are most heavily affected by cap and trade. That's very big, heavily emitting industries, of course, electricity generation, steel, concrete, construction, so forth. They would have suffered very badly by this, and President Obama has said he's going to look favorably on exempting them to some degree. If he does that, then the entire cost of a tax which is supposed to bring in very nearly the equivalent of the entire federal budget on average for the last 5 years, and it will bring it in every year for the next 8 years, $2 trillion a year. That is going to fall entirely on small businesses who are already disproportionately affected by the existing recession. If that happens, there will be bankruptcies all round, and it is even possible that this scheme, as at present conceived, and I must make this point very clear to you, could bankrupt the United States government itself.
Dr. Beisner, you criticize the promotion of solar panels and renewable energy in the developing world. Why do you believe this is not in the best interest of the poor?
Well, the developed world managed to do a great deal of its economic growth on the basis of the very inexpensive energy that was available to us by the development of grids and the like. Just recently, Amity Schley's book, The Forgotten Man, was published, A History of the Great Depression. She discusses the competition between the idea that there should be small local generating plants, indeed even possibly generators at every home, versus the idea of grids. And essentially what we're being asked to do when we say, let's have the small alternative energy things for people's huts and so on in Africa, is to choose what they figured out even at the time of the 1920s and 1930s was not going to work here. It's a short-term, really illusory solution that has long-term costs by directing capital investment away from the types of generation and distribution of electricity that can reach the lowest cost per kilowatt hour delivered in the longer term. And so what we're actually doing is asking the poor to adapt fairly expensive short-term solutions in exchange for much cheaper long-term solutions for their energy needs.
So what do we do, what's the best approach to help developing nations take to help world's poor and impoverished?
Well, as Bjorn Lomborg and the Copenhagen Consensus have pointed out, certainly one of the most important things that we can do is to promote the Doha round and world trade generally, because general world trade is the most important thing for raising income levels, and as income levels rise, those can generate enough capital investment to support the provision of large-scale energy systems to electrify the homes of the roughly 2.6 billion people around the world who don't have them. Rather than highly centralized governmental solutions, I think the market solutions are the best. And that's what we learn from the history of economics.
My time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Capps, California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses. I agree with my colleague who said this is quite a stellar panel and very interesting. I thank all the witnesses, and I want to thank especially and associate myself with the remarks of Bishop Holloway, since you represent my faith tradition. And I feel I must make a brief disclaimer to you, Lord Monckton. I am privileged to represent a congressional district in California which stretches a bit over 200 miles of coastline. And I want to reassure you that my neighbors and I have no intention of packing up and leaving anytime soon. But
I'm delighted.
Thank you. Mr. Swiger, as I mentioned, my congressional district lies entirely within California's coastal zone. We must plan for sea rise. And then in that regard, I suppose I could represent any community along the coastal areas of our nation and perhaps even indeed of the world. It's been said in my area, if we bury our heads in the sand on the issue of sea rising, we may drown. Could you give some specific strategies that managers, federally, locally, and other kinds of interveners could manage to help our communities to be more resilient in the face of climate change? How might we, or should we, change some of our approaches to the management of coastal areas?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to respond. I think the first thing we need to do is actually to cap pollution, because the most important thing we can do is quit feeding the beast that's raising the sea levels and warming our planet. Secondly, I think it's important for us to do really good downscaling of the models that are currently being used to assess the condition of our planet. And I would say the greater granularity we can get into those models, the more we can know exactly what we're dealing with locally. And I think it's important as we plan those futures that we anticipate the range of sea level rise, and that goes for water supplies, sewage and stormwater management. I think it also speaks to the design of culverts and all the other things that we do in community. We need to understand that we're going to have more vigorous rainstorms. Coastal flooding is going to be more intense in many places. But I think it's so important to get that downscaling right so that we know precisely the kind of choices we need to make for both humans and nature.
Thank you. And Mr. Carl, this is what your agency does. I don't have time to ask you, but I'm certainly very interested in working with the NOAA as we design this granularity to be specific to our communities. And you have people in my district that I'm very grateful for, and I look forward to that partnership. I want to turn the rest of my time to the comments that were made by Mr. Wasco and Bishop Holloway. You made the statement, Mr. Wasco, that it probably will cost upwards of $50 billion to address adaptation needs. And it has been alluded to that, like the wildlife and the marine life, whose creatures are most impacted by climate change and are not really responsible for it, nor in a position to really adapt a lot. The poorest of the poor, as the bishop described, are often living in coastal areas. Again, didn't contribute very much to this and will certainly be at the mercy. And there's a moral compulsion, which I hope each of you will address, but there's also a piece of it that I want to get on the record, that it would be in our interest. It's an investment, really, that could be made to assist these communities in adaptation to climate change, because it will can provide their self-empowerment and their ability to decrease their dependency and to increase their self-sufficiency. And I'll let you, I don't have much time, but maybe if each of you could say a word to this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would fundamentally agree that it is in our national interest to address adaptation needs around the world for several reasons. One is the security dimension that has been alluded to already. A second has to do with costs that we would face from responding to disasters. So, for example, helping provide irrigation equipment, improved agricultural practices, drought and water-resistant seeds, those kind of things help in reducing the risk of famine or other food crises. Similarly, helping communities improve and strengthen their infrastructure, their roads, their bridges, their schools, their clinics, helps in reducing potential disaster response costs down the road. And
I don't want to, I know you could say more, but I want to ask the chairman's indulgence if I could ask my bishop to make one word on this.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry.
I look at this in a three-tiered way, that in our work of dealing with the issues and problems of many different people around the world, I see that one pillar must be emergency and immediate aid. That's incumbent upon us. The other is where we can to work as in an accompaniment model. Rather than telling folks what to do, we work with them to see what we can jointly discover as the best way to build capacity, the capacity that might lead towards self-sufficiency. And the third thing is advocacy for those who do not have a voice, but who have just as much a stake in the quality of life as anyone else. So these are the three areas I think that we're most effective, and look for legislation here, since we are for lack of a better term, the biggest dog in the pound. So we have a higher responsibility since we have higher resource.
Thank you. Mr. Shimkus of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great to have the panel. Apologize for being in and out. That's kind of our line of work. Let me ask a question. When we've had these debates in the previous year, we used to talk about the off-ramp. It's not being talked about very much now. And the basic premise was, if China and India do nothing, all our pain and agony is for no results. Should there be an off-ramp in legislation on climate change? And just say kind of yes or no, maybe a little phrase so I can get my time in. Bishop Holloway?
I don't believe so, sir.
Okay.
And,
if it can be quickly.
Okay, yes, that's impossible.
Why is it impossible?
Because ministers cannot speak briefly.
Oh. I thought it's impossible because China and India will never agree to any cap on carbon. And so to assume that China and India will be involved in any regime to control climate, that's the impossibility. Mr. Wasco?
We have the greatest historical responsibility for emissions. We have to take the lead, and I think that by taking the lead, we will be most able to bring others like China and India along.
Okay. Lord Monckton.
None of the disasters imagined by this committee will happen. Sea level in particular is not about to rise by more than around 8 inches to a foot this century. Even the UN says only 1.5 feet, maximum 2. That's not going to do any damage except in places where the land is subsiding for non-climate change reasons. The Chinese and the Indians are perfectly aware of this. They have declared over and over again, and rightly, that they're not going to do this, and therefore you should indeed have an off-ramp. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Beisner.
Yes, we should have an off-ramp for precisely that sort of reason, but also simply because the assumption behind all of this is that the climate change that we're seeing has been human-driven. Climate change and human-driven climate change are not the same thing. And the increasing tendency of the most recent scientific publications has been to magnify the apparent natural contribution and minimize the human contribution.
Mr. Schweiger.
I believe that the Himalayas are at great risk. The Chinese and Indian governments are well aware of those risks. And
Should there be an off-ramp?
I believe what we ought to do is work closely with China, particularly to find common ground to make the reduction.
Should there be an off-ramp?
I do not believe that we should back away from our responsibility.
Should there be an off-ramp?
No.
Thank you. Mr. Stevenson.
We can't control what China does. We have to take action irregardless of what they do, so there should not be an off-ramp.
Thank you. Mr. Carl.
Our agency works to provide the science to help provide that.
You're right. Very good. Give my poster, Ryan. We had testimony here. I want to talk to the impact on the middle class and the poor. My district represents 30 counties in rural southern Illinois, stretching from the state capital, Springfield, down to the Paducah, Kentucky, Indiana line. This was a mine, as I said in my opening statement. 1,200 miners lost their jobs. I now know through additional research 4 other mines closed primarily because of the Clean Air Act amendments. The economy of southern Illinois has been devastated through the mine closures. The Coal Association of Ohio testified just last week 36,000 mine workers lost their jobs. This is an incredible impact on the livelihood, and it does fall disproportionately on the poor. They will pay the burden of this through job loss, through long distances, through travels. Lord Monckton, talk to me about this debate on, are we a carbon-starved planet?
Well, Will Happer testified, he's from Princeton, testified in front of the Senate committee with Dr. Pachauri on this recently, and Will Happer's view that yes, we are carbon-starved. If we go back to the Cambrian era, 7,000 parts per million compared with less than 400 parts per million today. Go back to the Triassic era, 175 million years ago, at the time when the aragonite corals, the most fragile of all the corals, came into being by algal symbiosis for the first time. Again, around 6,500 to 7,000 parts per million of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a plant food. It's necessary.
Say that again. Carbon dioxide is what?
It's plant food.
It's plant food.
Yeah. Without it, all plant life, and therefore all life that depends on it,
so if we
would disappear.
decrease the use of carbon dioxide, are we not taking away plant food from the atmosphere?
Yes, indeed you are. The U.S. Forest Service has very good figures showing the enormous growth in the cubic yard.
So all our good intentions could be for vain. In fact, we could be doing just the opposite of what the people who want to save the world are saying.
You could indeed. You're quite right.
And I would just, the basic finish with this comment is, the earth will not be destroyed by a flood. And I yield back my time.
Thank you. We have, I believe, 4, maybe 5 more members. We could go with a lightning round of 2-minute apiece and vote, or we could continue and then come back. The chair would suggest we do a lightning round of 2-minute apiece. And I just wonder if anyone would have objections to that.
Vote's going to start here in 30 seconds.
Yeah, vote's going to start just briefly. I would suggest We will, the chair is sacrificing his time in order to move forward. If there's no objection to that, let me suggest that we do
I would
that.
object and just make that decision once the time comes for the call of vote.
We will always respect Mr. Shimkis's views, at least on this very small issue. Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panel for coming here. I think good call. Your testimony is excellent. And I want to congratulate the chairman, Markey, for pulling together this hearing. You know, when we discuss adaptation, I can't help think about my home district in California for two reasons. One is by analogy to climate change, and the other is by an already in progress impact of climate change. The first that I want to discuss is earthquakes. California is earthquake country, and we've learned a lot about how to adapt to earthquakes. We build our buildings better, and the results are pretty dramatic. Although we still have a lot to learn and a lot to do to make our cities safer. The second is water. You know, many glaciers are receding around the world, and California depends on its snowpack. So we're deeply engaged in planning and preparing for this, and I think that's an adaptation to global warming. So building buildings better and more resilient and building better waterways is good sense. The threat of global warming is just adds urgency to this whole issue. Mr. Mockton, I have a question. Do you think we should stop planning for earthquakes and stop adapting for water changes, or what should we do in this case?
So, as far as earthquakes are concerned, there is no connection between earthquakes and global warming.
No, but it's adapting to...
you are on. Yes, of course, you should always adapt to natural change.
Should we adapt to water coming down from the Sierras?
Yes, if as California is a very heavy user of water, you will need to make sure there are continuing water supplies.
So adapting to a change in progress is a good idea.
So of course, adaptation to natural changes that occur is very sensible.
Thank you.
If there were any
Mr. Carl,
changes also.
May I ask you, Mr. Carl, could you just give me a little bit of detail about some of the models, the resolution that you have, the accuracy that you have? I'm a scientist, a mathematician, and I did spend a career in modeling, so I'm interested technically in where we are with this stuff.
Yeah, one of the things we can tell you is that the models today are good enough to be able to identify some of the causes for some of the water issues out west with respect to changes in the snow melt season. Snow melting, from the observations, we already see it's melting earlier, more frequently. That runoff occurs more earlier. It means there's less water available later in the summer for use. That kind of an activity, that kind of process is expected to continue and accelerate as global warming continues on into the future. So that's one example from the standpoint of water. Another one has to do with changes in heavy precipitation events. We are seeing a change in the frequency of heavy precipitation.
So you have confidence in the resolution of these models and the accuracy of these models?
Yes.
In a sort of an average sense?
In a broad sense, yes.
Okay. Well, we'll have to talk more about that on a different minute. I'm going to yield back to be courteous to my other...
Thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Carl, in a way, your federal agency is an adaptation, is it not? Isaac Klein, the famed meteorologist in Galveston with the storm that Gene Green mentioned of 106 or 7 years ago, I mean, your federal agency came into existence as a consequence of the troubles that Mr. Klein encountered at that point with not being able to predict what was fixing to happen to them, and of course the large loss of life that then ensued. So in many ways what we're seeing today with your federal agency is an adaptation to the fact that if you develop coastal areas, from time to time you will be visited by hurricanes. Is that not correct?
There's no question.
Now, on the issue of hurricanes, I'd apologize for not having the data in front of me, but it seems like in a newspaper report from just a few days ago, we have entered into a period of a relative lull in hurricanes. Is that am I correct in that?
All I can tell you is that we have, over the past several decades, seen an increase in hurricane activity. And in fact, the most recent paper, looking at all the global oceans, have identified fairly conclusively that since the early 80s, the intensity of the strongest storms has actually increased. Now, one has to recognize when it gets down to smaller and smaller scales, because we have fewer hurricanes, it's more difficult to say, for example, yes, we're seeing a change in intensity of storms affecting a particular part of the coastline.
And I don't mean to be disrespectful, but the chairman's limited my time. We see cycles. We're in a bad recession right now. We're told that it is equivalent to the Great Depression of the 1930s, but we don't have the adverse weather phenomenon that they encountered in the 1930s in the form of the Dust Bowl. But having moved to the state of Texas as a very, very young child back in the early 50s, I remember very well the 7 years that it didn't rain. As I recall, the newspapers attributed that to the fact that the Russians were testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, and that was the Russian fallout that was responsible for no rain. I guess our fallout was exempt, but nevertheless, there always seems to be a reason that we will look for when we encounter these odd weather cycles. So how do we know, as we're sitting here and we're going to make policy, significant policy that's going to affect the next 3 generations of Americans, how do we know that we are just simply sitting here observing what are naturally occurring cycles in our climate? What would be the fingerprint? What would be the signature? What's the sine qua non for man-made, for evidence that this is a man-made phenomenon?
That's an excellent question, and I can tell you what NOAA is doing is what we actually do is go back in time and actually simulate in our computers the kinds of conditions that have occurred that actually led to various intensities and frequencies of hurricanes each season. And one of the things I can say with the American Recovery Act, we actually now will have access to supercomputing, petaflop, state-of-the-art computers. We'll be running these models in much higher resolution mode to be able to pinpoint with greater accuracy and greater
understanding. So right now, we just simply do not know. We don't have the data that we are required to have.
We want more. Right now,
and I don't disagree, and I don't mean to be disrespectful. I only have a limited amount of time, and Lord Mark.
All I can tell you is that the projections in the future in the models show more intense hurricanes. Right now, the linkage in terms of a specific attribution between what we've seen and intense hurricanes still awaits more scientific study.
Lord Monkton, you were wanting to tell me something.
Yes, sir. You wanted to know what the current state of play is about hurricanes. Over the last 30 years, satellites have been monitoring the frequency and intensity of hurricanes, and an accumulated cyclone energy index is compiled, which is a 2-year running sum of the frequency and intensity of all hurricanes, tropical storms around the equator, and the current value of that accumulated cyclone energy index is the lowest it has been in the 30 years globally that's been recorded. So you're quite right.
You'll make that data available to Mr. Carl to plug into the supercomputer?
I'll give him the graph. It's been published recently.
Wonderful. I look forward to that. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back in the interest of time.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Mr. Welch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Carl, you're having this debate here about CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. A lot of evidence that they're actually rising, and whether they're doing so in line with the projections of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. My question is, the level of CO2 in the atmosphere easily determined? I mean, is that really a scientific debate about whether we can measure it? And is it not the case that the level, in fact, is higher than in the past IPCC projections?
Answer your question, it's probably the most confident measurement we can make, and that is the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and indeed it is increasing, and it is due to human causes. And related to comparison to IPCC, again, what IPCC uses are scenarios, and there's a number of scenarios they use in terms of how carbon dioxide concentrations would change in the future without any policy options, but with considerations of economic growth, technology intervention. And if you look at those scenarios, the current levels of carbon dioxide concentration are very consistent with those models. Some, in some respects, might even be a little bit lower.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. At this time, the committee will be in recess, I think about 12:30. Can the panel all stay with us? Is that acceptable? Thank you for your courtesy. Mr. Schweiger may not be able to, but we appreciate it. We'll be back about 12:30. Thank you. Mr. Scalise, maybe? The hearing will reconvene, and we'll hear from Mr. Stearns. Excuse me, Mr. Scalise. Ready? Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Looks like Mr. Schweiger has left. Is this gentleman, Mr. Koiszczak? Is that your? Okay. Can you answer questions on? There was part of Mr. Schweiger's written testimony that I've got a big issue with. Is in relation to his claim that the deaths attributed to Hurricane Katrina well, the deaths from Hurricane Katrina are attributed to global warming. He actually attributes 1,800 deaths from Katrina to global warming. And I understand that he's left. I'm sorry that he's left because I represent a district that includes many of those areas that were hit by Hurricane Katrina and, in fact, incurred some of those deaths, and I take strong issue with the fact that he would attribute those deaths to global warming when, in fact, there is substantial record of documentation that both points out that global warming had nothing to do with Katrina's deaths, but in fact it was the failure of federal levees as well as the problems caused from coastal erosion. Now, what documentation, if you can speak for Mr. Schweiger, what documentation did he base his assertion on?
I'd be happy to speak for Mr. Schweiger. We didn't, in our testimony, state that global warming was directly responsible for that particular.
In written testimony, it's in his written testimony that he submitted right here.
There is certainly
on page
a link,
9.
and we made the link in the testimony between global warming and that storm because of the fact that there is extensive scientific data showing a linkage between the intensification of coastal storms and global warming. And so although you can never pinpoint one particular storm and saying that storm was caused by global warming, you could certainly say, as we did in the testimony, that a storm of that nature is becoming more prevalent in this era of warming. And I would defer to my colleague from NOAA to give you the citations to the papers, but there is extensive literature in this area.
I'll read his quote. Increases in weather-related disasters associated with global warming carry more than an economic cost. The perils of weather-related disasters are exemplified by Hurricane Katrina, which caused 1 million evacuees to flee and more than 1,800 deaths. Now, I would urge you to go and read the report by the Army Corps of Engineers, who acknowledges that the failure of federal levees is what led to the deaths from Hurricane Katrina, as well as the increased damage done by storms over the years due to coastal erosion, which at the state level, the state is working on restoring the coast, which is a very important issue for blocking future storms. But I would just urge you to spread that word back to Mr. Schweiger that I think it diminishes his credibility when he makes statements attributing deaths from Katrina to global warming to try to further his cause, because that had nothing to do with it. And if he's got some proof that carbon emissions had anything to do with the failure of those levees, tell him to get that information to the Corps of Engineers, because no one has ever asserted that up until this point. I see Mr. Lord Monkton nodding if you had anything you wanted to add to that, Lord Monkton.
Certainly, sir, with pleasure. Mr. Justice Burton in the High Court considered this matter because, of course, Al Gore has also, in his sci-fi comedy horror movie, attributed the Hurricane Katrina to global warming. And Mr. Justice Burton, after hearing very careful evidence from both sides, including our own meteorological office, which tends to share the views of your NOAA over here, came to the very firm conclusion that that link cannot be established. And it's also worth recording that Hurricane Katrina was only a Category 3 at the point where it made landfall, and as you have rightly said, sir, the real failure here was the failure of the local administration, and I cannot for the moment remember which party it is, to make sure that the levees were adequately maintained.
The Army Corps of Engineers, which actually issued a report acknowledging that those levees failed in a way that they should not have failed for a Category 3. Following up on a point you made about Al Gore, because Al Gore has said on record that the UN is wrong and sea levels may rise upwards of 20 feet by the end of the 20th century. Do you prescribe to that view that Al Gore's...
I have recently consulted the world's foremost expert on sea level, Professor Niels Axel Mørner, who has written 520 papers on the subject. He tells me that sea level in the last century rose 8 inches, compared with an average centennial rate of rise over the past 10,000 years of 4 feet per century, and his best estimate is that it will be another 8 inches now. The UN says perhaps 1.5 as its central estimate in the whole of the next century.
And I'm about to run out of time. One last question, Lord Monckton. Over the past decade or so, have temperature observations verified the model predictions that we keep hearing about?
No.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Chair Alito, to myself. Mr. Carl, the Right Honorable Lord 3rd Viscount Monckton of Brenchley has told us that the Earth is cooling, which is an extraordinary statement given the unprecedented amount of scientific consensus to the contrary. I want to refer you to a slide showing 5-year averages of NAS, GISS data, and CRU Hadley data. These are, you have to look behind you to see it. I'm sorry, Mr. Carl, over to your right. These are 5-year averages that basically show a temperature in 5-year periods. Is it helpful to look at 5-year averages when we're looking at climate trends?
It's certainly helpful to average over longer periods than a few years. And in fact, I just want to point out that in the IPCC report, the reference to linkage between human contributions to changes in atmospheric composition and global warming was over the last 50 years. And there's a lot of danger in taking that record and looking at year-to-year variations and talking about cooling or warming.
Thank you. And my next chart, if we can put the next chart up, I think shows the wisdom of that basically shows annual temperatures, which does show the temperatures in 08 somewhat less than 04, but the trends are obviously disturbing, and I would trust the 2000 IPCC scientists. The next slide, please, showing observed monthly carbon dioxide trends as measured at Mauna Loa since 1973 compared with the emission scenarios of the IPCC will show that, in fact, the emissions, actually the concentrations in the last several years have been higher, actually, than even the models. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Next slide, please. You can help me? You have a slide. It was the first slide of Lord Viscount Monckton. Yes. I was looking at this. I was intrigued by your testimony, Lord Monckton, and I was just wondering what this graph was.
That's merely the header sheet, so I know that the slides are up there. In fact, it's the view from my library in Rannoch.
Is this a coat of arms? Is that what they call this in England? Or?
No, sir. That is the portcullis, which is the symbol of the House of Lords, and superimposed upon it is the vice-comital coronet.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Lord Monckton, how much have the seas acidified since industrial times? By what percentage are there higher concentrations of the ions contributing to acidic oceans compared to pre-industrial times? I'll just take a number if you can give it to me.
Certainly, there has been no satisfactory measurement to establish it, but modeling suggests, and I don't know how reliable the modeling is, that the pH has reduced by 0.1.
And what percentage increase in ions? The scientists tell me that's a 30% increase in the ions concentration compared to pre-industrial times, and I'm a little stunned by your statement that there's no evidence in this. In fact, there's overwhelming evidence from multiple sources that our oceans are becoming more acidic, most recently off the coast of Washington State and Tatoosh Island, which showed the acidification caused by anthropomorphic, meaning us, putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, going into solution, and then making the oceans more acidic is actually accelerating even beyond the models, but it clearly is at extraordinarily high levels compared to pre-industrial times. Now, do you think that, given the value set that you bring to this testimony, considering that can adversely impact living creatures, including corals and phytoplankton at certain levels, that's something that we should make an effort to arrest?
No, sir, I don't think you need to, because if we go back a little bit further than the period you're looking at, and we go back to the Triassic era, where the most fragile of the corals first evolved, they were the aragonite corals. At that time, there was 6,500 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. One can presume, therefore, that there would have been more CO2 in the oceans at that time as well, and the corals did just fine. Indeed, that's when they evolved. So we know from these geological records that the fears over ocean acidification have been much exaggerated.
Well, your testimony is in stark contrast with the entire rest of the biological and botanical testimony, because you're talking about corals that were adapted to those conditions. We're talking about corals that are adapted to our conditions of acidity in the ocean. They are entirely different species. And in fact, it is shown by new research, so when you go back home, you can notify them in your country what we found in this country, which is acidification at certain levels, which we will approach in this century, retards the calcification and the deposition of calcium carbonate. That's a message for America, and just so you'll know, and we have lots of literature about this. I'd be happy to provide you. Thank you.
Without objection, sir, may I introduce into the record a recent book on the subject by Dr. Craig Idso, which is a comprehensive review of the literature on precisely this subject, and I think you will find that it does show a rather different picture.
Thank you. We enjoyed
portrayed. Thank you, sir.
Sure. We'll insert that in the record by unanimous consent. Mr. Call, do you want to have any comments on ocean acidification, what NOAA's findings have been?
It's a very important issue that our agency is looking at. I'm happy to report we've got some of the leading researchers in the world, Dr. Richard Feely, who just recently published a paper pointing out some of the observations that indicate that the oceans indeed are acidifying, and the projections with continued increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are for those increases to, we've gone up about a tenth in pH, another not a tenth of a unit, another 1/10 to 2/10 of a units with the kinds of concentrations as projected by IPCC.
Thank you. We'll turn to Mr. Stearns of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Lord Mockton, let me just give you a hypothetical question here that you might help me with.
Sir.
In mitigation, that is the elimination of CO2, let's say, for example, the United States adopted cap and trade, as well as all the other methods to totally eliminate energy-producing components that have CO2 emissions in this country. We totally eliminate it. How long would it take, theoretically, to bring back the level of CO2 that we have in this country today if we were successful in eliminating it? Is there any studies or anybody that's done it state by state in the United States, for example, my home state, or is there any way to evaluate what the repercussions would be?
Let me start state by state. Yes, sir, the Science and Public Policy Institute publishes state by state surveys of what would happen to global temperatures if that state were to close down its emissions altogether and go back to the Stone Age without even the right to light a fire in your caves. And the effect on temperatures, is fair to say, on an individual state-by-state basis is negligible. If you were to close down the entire United States economy and go back to the Stone Age, then what would happen is that's going to take you a certain amount of time to do. As you reduce your production here, since your citizens will still require much the same in the way of goods and services as they had before, they will have to get them from overseas, from places like China and India, where, alas, emissions per unit of production are considerably higher, in some cases 3 or 4 times higher than they are here, and therefore the net effect of the United States shutting down her economy would be to increase carbon emissions worldwide, achieving the very reverse of the objective which was, however piously, intended.
Are there any time frames you could say this study was done on, so you could say theoretically if we shut down, like say over the next 7 years before we would see the CO2 emissions come up to what they are?
You would see virtually no decline at all, because so quickly would other countries take up the production that you forego. If you transfer your jobs and your industries and your wealth to other countries and get them to do the work that was once done here, then the uptake and therefore the increase in CO2 emissions will be more or less immediate. All you'll be doing is shooting yourselves economically in the foot, not only for no climatic benefit whatsoever, but actually you'd end up making things worse, and you'd end up making things worse more or less immediately.
You've used that term, shooting ourselves in the foot. I think I'll use one of your assistants, sort of call this kneecap and tax, which would be shooting ourselves in the kneecap and then coming back and tax us and putting us in perilous condition. Mr. Waskoff, I have an article here that says biofuels pushing up food prices and poverty, Oxfam indicates. And so, you know, we have these well-intended mandates from ethanol. They are enacted supposedly to help the environment, and yet there seems to be consequences, reading this article. Shouldn't we be cautious in implementing any new policy which would have far-reaching effects, such as a policy which change the entire energy base of our country, like kneecap and tax?
Well, I would say that it's absolutely the case that we need to be careful in designing a policy of this magnitude. I think that the consequences of climate change are so grave, particularly for poor people around the world and also in this country, that a lot of the care that must go into it is in fact making sure that emissions do not continue rising in a way that's going to lead to even greater harm down the road. And in the near term, since this hearing is focused on adaptation, I would just note that part of the care that we must take in designing climate policy is in fact to make sure that those who are being affected now by the current impacts of climate change are in fact having their needs met, and that the adaptation responses and the resilience responses that are necessary are in fact being put in place.
Would you state then that you think that we should scrap all biofuel targets in the world?
Well, if it's I mean, if the question goes to whether to entirely remove any policy supporting any kind of biofuels, that would not be our position. However, we do think that in the case of biofuels, because of the food consequences, that targets need to be looked at very closely in terms of how they may affect food supplies. And so corn ethanol is an excellent example where we have serious concerns about what it means to ramp up production of that because of the food consequences worldwide.
Do you have any percentages that you could use that ramped it up by? In other words, you talk about this biofuel mandates. Have they increased the global food prices by any percentage?
I'm not aware that we have a specific number that one can attribute to the increase. But
in the article, it says biofuels are responsible for 30% of the increase in global food prices, pushing 30 million people worldwide into poverty, the aid agency Oxfam said in a report Wednesday.
Yeah, I believe that that is, I will check and happy to get back to you in writing. I believe that that data reflects World Bank analysis of in their annual economic report last year.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Wolman of Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kostiak, your predecessor at the hearing, Mr. Schweiger, made a comment that the boreal forests are either now or soon to be giving off more carbon than they're sequestering. And I wonder if you could speak to why that is.
Thank you. We are currently seeing a die-off of forests all around the globe, and it's due to the increased heat stress of rising average surface temperatures around the globe.
And would part of the effect of that be then additional drought conditions and stress on the trees themselves?
That is correct.
And so what is the proper intervention, if you're a forester, to help ameliorate that problem?
Well, a number of ideas have been suggested. There is no easy answer. Much more research will be needed to manage our way through this problem. Obviously, the first step is we need to cut global carbon emissions because we're not going to be able to adapt our way out of this problem.
So you don't think managing the forest back to a more balanced system is an answer?
No, that's where I was heading next. My point is that forest management by itself will not solve this problem. The first step will be to cut carbon emissions. We will not be able to address the massive die-offs of forests we're seeing around the globe unless we start there. The second will be to look at natural resources adaptation efforts, and that involves more scientific research. It involves storing as much groundwater as possible. It means forest management to reduce some of the fuel load to avoid unnecessary catastrophic fires.
I appreciate especially that last point. I represent a district of 70,000 square miles, 10 or 11 national forests.
We've got forests there that are completely overstressed right now today. The Wainema National Forest, there's about 500 square miles. The bugs have been eating away at for a decade. It is ready to explode. And yet there are many organizations who care passionately about global climate change and CO2 emissions reductions that consistently, repeatedly, and aggressively appeal every proposal to go in and do thinning operations on these forests to get them back into balance with nature, frankly, because you can let them get back in balance a couple of ways. You can let catastrophic fire just wipe out the stand, or we can go in and using, and I think there's a pretty good basis of scientific knowledge on the number of trees per acre that would be historically correct, and yet the same organizations are opposing it. So I guess my question is, and Mr. Moncton, you want to, Lord Moncton, I'm sorry, maybe you want to speak to this as well. I know we sort of have this existing exchange policy in the world where we don't manage our federal forests in America. We'd rather rape and pillage forests around the globe for our wood. And I'm not exaggerating here. I mean, 60%, I think, of Oregon's forest land is federal, and it represents 6% of the trees that are actually harvested. I got counties that are at 19.7% unemployment. These folks, I was just out there, they don't understand why the forests are allowed to burn up around them and they can't even cut burn dead trees while they still have value. And what they further don't understand is that their heating bills are going to go up dramatically under cap and trade. And the one manufacturer that's kind of left in Eastern Oregon makes cement, the Ash Grove cement plant, and they figure they probably have to close. Now, I don't know how this helps people in poverty.
Sir, I sympathize with you entirely. The one thing you don't want to do in the present economic circumstances is start closing down the few industries that still remain in the name of this chimera of global warming, which visibly hasn't been happening for the last 7 years, though it has been happening for the last 300, during at least 270 of which we could not have had anything to do about it. As for the management of trees, you are quite right. It is essential that proper fire breaks be cleared and maintained so as to prevent forest fires. Forest fires are not new. They're not a consequence of global warming. They occur naturally. They are, in fact, part of the natural process by which forests manage themselves. But if one wishes to minimize that, you must have fire breaks, and that's what we do in the UK.
Plus, we're finding that even the old-growth trees now are getting stressed because some years of drought. When they get stressed, then the bugs come in and they kill the old growth trees, which many people would like to preserve. So it really is a problem. Let me shift gears because I only have 30 seconds left. My district also is home to some of the most active wind energy development out there, and our grid in the Northwest will soon have more wind on it than any other grid by percentage in the country. The question has recently come up by some groups that, and I thought this had been resolved, that wind energy and the wind turbines are killing raptors and birds. And so I would go to the the Wildlife Federation. Is that the view of your organization, that the wind energy we're putting in is, I thought they'd designed around this problem?
There are some negative impacts on wildlife from wind energy development. With that being said, these problems can be worked out. There are technical solutions. I mean, let's recognize, first of all, just installing the wind power by itself will take out some habitat. And then there are some collisions we're going to need to address, both with birds and bats. We are very much supportive of building out a massive wind energy complex. And it's a fundamental to the solution to global warming. This goes to our overall message here today. I mean, we're going to need to have a major investment in natural resources adaptation. And that it means a lot of public outreach so people can understand some of these trade-offs. There is no free energy source.
No.
And so we're going to have to find ways to minimize wind impacts. There are ways to place these renewable energy systems in the most degraded areas, or areas where there's already an extension of human footprint, and trying to protect those pristine areas. But at the same time, we have to get this wind energy development, this wind energy complex built.
But at the end of the day, you kind of have to put it where the wind is.
That's one of the key factors to look at, yes.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. My time's run out, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all. I appreciate your testimony from all of you.
Thank you. With the unanimous consent, the chair will put into the record a letter dated March 24th, 2009 from the Outdoor Industry Association, and another one from a group of organizations, including the League of Women Voters, dated March 25th, 2009. I would extend an opportunity to any of you who feel a burning passion to make another 1-minute statement on anything you didn't have a chance to say. We want to make sure the witnesses have a chance to respond to any of the questions you were asked. If any of you would like to take a minute to extend your comments, feel free to do so. Mr. Carl, would you like to? Don't feel compelled, by the way.
No, I don't. I just wanted...
Mr. Chairman, may I ask a question?
Certainly.
Does that mean we get a chance for a 1-minute response to their 1-minute question?
If Mr. Shimkus would like, I would certainly...
I mean, I'm just trying to find out the rules here.
I would be happy to extend a minute to Mr. Shimkus for sure, if that's so ordered by the two consensus builders of Shimkus and Inslee. Mr. Carl.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank the committee for addressing this extremely important issue and note that there is an enormous amount of climate change science that is available today. A major challenge for our agency, which we hope to be able to address in the short few years ahead, is to take that science and make it available to help make decisions, practical decisions that are required from a local scale all the way up to national and international scales. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson.
I would parrot that, but I think we have an information shortage here, especially at the local level, such that we're not prepared to make economic decisions yet. We need the data first before we can do the cost-benefit trade-offs on what's going to be worth the investment and what's not. And the same is true with the cap-and-trade bill. It depends upon the way you design it, how expensive or not it's going to be, and whether the benefits are worth the cost. So I just don't think we're there yet. I think we need to negotiate the specific details of any legislation and see what that means before we can say universally that it's going to cost jobs and tank the economy.
Mr. Koistak?
Mr. Inslee, thank you, Chairman, for the opportunity. Very much want to associate myself with my colleagues' remarks about the need for more additional scientific research. If you look at the overall agenda for natural resources adaptation, we have to recognize, first of all, we're playing major catch-up on the scientific research here. There's been a lot of investment on the mitigation side. We're really just getting going on adaptation. That being said, there are many, many things that the scientists already agree on that are essentially no-regret strategies for making our natural systems more resilient to the harmful impacts of climate change. And we've heard some of them today, whether it's buffering people and wildlife from coastal storms by rebuilding wetlands complex. We should be doing those now. The longer we wait, the more difficult and expensive it gets. And so when we came here today and advocated for a very substantial, large-scale investment in natural resources adaptation as part of climate change, this is something we can demonstrate today has far greater economic benefits than the cost, and there's no reason to hesitate.
Thank you. Dr. Beisner?
I would just simply ask the members of the committee to study very carefully the results of the findings of the Copenhagen Consensus, which attempts to rank a variety of different responses to climate change, assuming the IPCC's scenarios to be accurate, ranks the variety of different responses and responses to other problems pressing upon mankind. We don't have infinite resources. There are opportunity costs. And I think there are things that need to take much higher priority than anything we can do in either mitigation or adaptation in response to climate.
Lord Monckton?
Thank you, sir. Don't do cap and trade. Remember the poor. Remember your taxpayers. Beware rent seekers, particularly from the scientific community. Remember the warning of Eisenhower against the technocrats who would eventually take over and try to push you in various directions. Pay no attention. Keep your spending down as a state and as a nation, and God bless you all.
Mr. Wasco?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to address two things quickly. First of all, on the Katrina issue, I would agree that there was a massive failure of the levees. There was also a failure of the emergency response system. But I think what the lesson that we should draw from this is what is necessary in the context of increasing risk from climate change. And as we have increasing risk, on the one hand, we also have to have resilience and adaptive strategies on the other hand going together. And so dealing with the levees is not, or our emergency response system, is not something separate and apart from addressing climate change. It should be integrated, and it should be integrated as well with a dramatic reduction in emissions. The second thing I just wanted to quickly address is the question of renewable energy in developing countries. And without getting into detail, just to say that our view is that renewable energy does in fact have many benefits in the development context, and often, in fact, renewable energy is what is going to be necessary for the poorest around the world to be able to have access to modern energy sources.
Thank you. Bishop?
Thank you very much. I thought it was very aptly put earlier by Mr. Shimkus that God has no intention of destroying what he has created. He has placed upon us, in addition to that, a covenant that we must honor with him, but also with one another in the care of the earth. This is part of our responsibility as good stewards. It's also part of our responsibility to care for one another as we do this. There are others who are affected by what's going on with the changes in the climate and have no way of dealing with it in a way that's life-sustaining or capacity-building. We're committed to doing that and continuing that work, and call upon Congress at this time not only to carry out its traditional responsibilities as well as it has in the past, but also to take leadership in thinking for those of us and to advocate for those of us who cannot speak for ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Shimkus, would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, to assume that man can control the world's climate is a very dangerous and very arrogant position. It reminds me of the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, when man thought they could build a tower to reach God. It was in their arrogance that they thought they could do things that only God can do. What hasn't been talked about a lot, I think the impact on the poor has been talked about, the rural areas, the job dislocation. I think we've ferreted that out. What I would ask you all to look at is especially that climate cap and trade, cap and tax, this trading floor. Numerous times my colleagues on the other side have attacked the New York Mercantile Exchange. Farmers have always attacked the Chicago Board of Trade, because big money interests go into these, and it's an area for big money to make big money by setting the price for carbon on a trading floor. They will be held accountable when they attack the trading floor venue, as they always do in this failed policy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Scalise. If you'd like to make a comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First point out, the National Hurricane Center actually tracks hurricanes over the last 150 or so years, and you might not be able to see this where you're sitting, but there have actually been periods going back over 100 years where there were higher numbers of hurricanes and bigger hurricanes than Hurricane Katrina, but clearly the devastation that was caused from Katrina and the deaths related to it were caused by, number one, failure of federal levees, but also the erosion of the coast, none of which has anything to do with changing in climate temperatures. And clearly, I think the science on global change is not settled. One thing that is settled is the cost to this country. Peter Orszag, President Obama's own budget director, stated before this committee that this type of policy, cap and trade policy, an energy tax, would actually cost every American family over $1,300 a year in increased energy costs that they would be paying. That for those people that think people making below $250,000 a year won't pay a dime, you give them that $1,300 bill, you're going to have a hard time explaining it to them. That one area is settled as a result of this policy that we should defeat, and I yield back.
Thank you. I just would like to point out we have one of our witnesses from the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, and I would just suggest that fulfilling our stewardship responsibility does not involve destroying all creatures great and small. The Lord God made them all, and in fact that's what's going on right now. And I don't think we can help the polar bear adopt. They're gone unless something changes in our climate policy. I don't think the people of Shishmaref can have a problem. Their city in Alaska is melting in the sea. We can't just tell them they just kind of have to pick up and move to Florida. It's just not their cup of tea, and it's not our right to make them move. And I would suggest that we appreciate wisdom from all over the country, but the Englishman I will be listening to is Sir Isaac Newton, whose physical laws are quite well accepted, as is the science on everything we've been talking about here today. Thank you very much.
Until Einstein.
The last word.
Great special. Great special. Is that all right? Good. Yes.
It's good to meet you.
Thank you.
Do you have a card? I'd be interested in continuing the conversation. Thanks very much. Sure. It's good to meet you.
All right.
Take care.